The story begins when I was a child. My father at the time was a big hunter and trapper in the woods nearby. He would set traps for small game out in the woods. I remember one evening my father coming in late from checking his traps. His hands and shirt were covered in blood. Thankfully the blood wasn't his, but of that of an animal that had been caught in his trap and something bigger eating it. I remember from that night on that the woods were off limits to us kids. This was quite awful, since my brothers and sisters often played in the woods nearby. I remember asking my father why we weren't allowed in the woods, and he always gave the same answer. It wasn't safe. Over the next couple of years, my father would stop hunting altogether. Hunting was something that my father and his family were quite passionate about. To see him no longer interested in his most favorite hobby was quite disturbing. Something happened in the woods that had spooked him entirely, and he wouldn't tell us what it was. I remember one Halloween, I was 15, that my brother and my friends decided to go out into those woods and stay the night in our treehouse that we'd built many years ago. Thankfully, our treehouse wasn't more than 10 minutes into the woods, but still, we were pretty terrified. Knowing that there was something out in the woods that spooked my father gave me the creeps. Before we entered the tree line, I already had the feeling of being watched, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be labeled the coward in our friend group. At this point, the sun had set, so it was dark out. We had our flashlights to guide us, but the woods were so thick that it seemed to swallow all the light that the lights gave off. The 10-minute walk into the woods felt like forever. Maybe it was further back than I remembered, or maybe we were just scared. Finally, we reached the treehouse. The treehouse seemed smaller than I remembered, and it looked quite weathered, but overall, it looked to be in decent condition. We climbed the ladder to our treehouse and went inside. While inside, my friends and I found all of our favorite toys that we'd left there years ago. We had a brief rush of nostalgia hitting us all at once. For a very brief moment, we felt like we were younger kids and completely forgot that we were in the middle of the woods at night. While we were exploring the treehouse and playing with our toys, we heard a scream coming from the woods. The scream sounded close. It was a type of scream you wouldn't typically associate with a human, especially out in the woods at this hour of night. All of us were silent. Out of fear of being spotted, all of us turned off our flashlights. We were now out in the middle of the woods at night with no lights on, with something outside. At least we were remotely safe in the treehouse, or so we thought. The treehouse provided a false sense of security. Whatever it was out in the woods probably wasn't capable of climbing the ladder. After coming to this realization, my friends and I felt that we were safe enough to turn on our flashlights. After peering around in the woods for a few minutes and not seeing anything, we decided that we've had our fun and to turn in for the night. This would mean that we'd have to climb down from our safe spot in our treehouse, down into the woods. We were no longer wanting to stay in that treehouse, but no one was wanting to be the first one down into the woods. We picked my brother, who happened to be the smallest in the group, to be the first one down into the woods. We all promised to watch guard and make sure that nothing got him. I'm not entirely sure if my brother believed what we were saying, but he decided to go down anyways. As my brother descended into the woods below, I began to have that feeling again of being watched. That feeling of being watched was now accompanied with the smell of rotting flesh. I couldn't exactly see whatever it was, but I knew it was out there. Not wanting to scare my brother, I didn't say anything, and let him continue climbing down into the woods. Once at the bottom, my other friend decided to go down. When my friend was around halfway down, he stopped dead in his tracks and shined his flashlight off into the woods. All of us gathered around to see what he was looking at, but we couldn't see anything. Everyone was silent and intently looking for any type of movement. That's when we saw it. At first it looked like a deer, but all of its flesh had rotted off of its face. The deer's mouth was unusual. Instead of having dull teeth, it had sharp fangs. All of our stomachs dropped. It was as if we were looking at death itself. My brother, being on the ground, was not able to see what we were looking at. He had no idea that the creature was only a few meters away from him. Without hesitating, I told my brother to run and to get Dad. My brother took off into the dark woods, leaving his flashlight on. I looked back to see the creature again, but the creature was gone. I feared the worst and thought that it was going for my brother. My brother was rather slow, and him leaving his light on made him an easy target. We all screamed for him to run faster and to not stop or look back at all. But as we were screaming, we saw his flashlight stop moving. We were all terrified. Whatever that thing was, it probably had my brother. The time that this story took place was before cell phones, so calling for help was out of the question. We were sitting ducks in that treehouse. About 10 minutes later, that smell of rotting flesh came back again. We turned off our flashlights so that we wouldn't give away our position. I think the thing knew that we were out there, but didn't know that we were in a tree. We could hear the thing huffing and making grunting sounds beneath our treehouse. It was frustrated. I think it could smell us, but didn't have the common sense to look up. All of us were staring down into the dark woods, listening for any sounds. After 5 or 10 minutes of complete silence, one of my friends decided to turn on the flashlight, a move to this day I regret. When he turned the flashlight on, it illuminated the bottom of the woods, which revealed a horrifying sight. The gross and decrepit creature was next to the ladder, looking up at us. When it finally realized where we were, it let out this horrific screech, a sound that I can only describe as our certain death. The creature then began to climb. The thing was slow and deliberate, knowing well that we weren't able to go anywhere. It was as if it was playing with its food. When the creature was about halfway up the ladder, the sound of a gunshot pierced the night. We were all stunned. The shot had hit a good portion of the creature, and the creature climbed down the ladder. More shots rang out, and the creature ran off into the woods, but it didn't seem injured. We looked down to find my father shooting at the creature with my brother with him. My brother had made it back. We all climbed down the ladder and raced back to my house. My friends and I were expecting a huge lecture from my father, but surprisingly, he didn't say anything. I think he was just thankful that we were okay. My brother was a hero that night. He saved all of our lives. If it wasn't for him and his bravery, or should I say us forcing him to be the first one down, I'm pretty sure we'd have all died. That's the story of my brother saving our lives from that thing. When I was younger, about 16 or so, I had an encounter with something strange in the forest. I was young and naive, and I didn't give nature the proper level of respect and basically was cocky. Our cabin was on the lake. The whole area is forested for the most part. I was there on vacation with my cousin and grandparents. It was a nice and hot summer day, and we decided to play some airsoft. I took airsoft really seriously. I wore a full ghillie suit and even a camouflage mask. We had a battle which I took into the woods where I felt the most comfortable. We were about 150 meters into the woods when we stopped. Then I decided to tease my cousin. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched," jokingly. Unfortunately, it turned out not to be much of a joke, because I immediately then noticed that the woods were dead quiet, which only happens when a large predator is around. I was on edge very quickly. Next, the feeling of being watched hit hard, so I started scanning the surrounding forest. Then, I saw it. Its whitish teeth gave it away. What I saw was at the edge of a clearing about 40 meters from us. The thing was crouched down. It was holding onto a tree with its left hand. It was panting and watching us. The first thing that came into my mind was that it was a werewolf. I said to my cousin, "We have to go," and he bolted. I still had my eyes on it when my cousin started sprinting. The creature charged. It ran on two legs for about 10 feet or so, and then it dropped down on all fours. Then I turned and sprinted. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me. Once back at the cabin, we discussed it. It was still unclear if my cousin saw what I saw. I told him that I thought it was a bear to not freak him out, but I know bears, and that wasn't a bear. My father is Navajo, who was raised on the res in northern Arizona. My mother is white. I grew up in Southern California, but grew up going to the res every year or so. I eventually moved and worked there. I am not a skinwalker expert by any means, but I'll share what I know. The earliest experience I had was one of the first times I went solo on my trip out to our ranch on the reservation. I traveled with my cousin and a few friends. Our ranch is pretty much in the middle of nowhere, the nearest people being at the very closest are about 10 miles away, so you're pretty much on your own. Our first night out there, we arrived around 2 a.m. and there was no moon. It was pitch black. We had a hard time finding our hogan, a traditional Navajo house. We decided to just camp near a cattle corral, which we found. We set up our tents and we were knocked out until the sun came up. When I woke up, I took a little walk around our campsite and found coyote tracks which encircled our camp and actually got pretty close to our tents and campfire, which was pretty weird and a bad sign for several reasons. The rest of the day went without incident. We woke up, cooked breakfast, explored the northern rim of the Grand Canyon on the reservation side, and checked out our old hogan in the area. We stayed up pretty late that night. We were out exploring at night on our four-wheeler on some off-road trails. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. and we were driving on a rocky road that went up into a small canyon. We arrived at one of the hogans and settled down. There was myself, my cousin, and my 2 white friends. We talked for a while, and in that very moment, everyone stopped talking. That's when it happened. The door began to shake violently, as if someone kicked the door as hard as they could. It was loud and strong enough to where you could hear the lock rattle, and the door bounced back and forth on the wooden frame. My friends shot up in bed. What the freak is that? They had reason to be alarmed. We were quite far from anyone else, and they knew that. It was extremely quiet out there. I got out of bed and grabbed a shotgun and told my cousin to get his rifle. I walked to the door and motioned him to go forward, and I said, "You go left, I go right." I'm not really sure why, but I wasn't scared despite the obvious weirdness of what was going on. I ripped the door open and we both slipped out of the door, one after another, and swept the area. We looked everywhere we could and went to the truck and got the spotlight and swept the area some more. Nothing. No footprints, no animals, nothing. We decided to send a message and shot some rounds off to scare whatever it was away. I think we were all kind of worried, but eventually we went back into the hogan and settled back in. Eventually, they all fell asleep, but I hid my nervousness and my heart was still racing. It wasn't until everyone was quiet and asleep that I noticed the thumping. I heard it quite faintly through the rock walls, and when I put my ear to the wall, I heard it a lot better. It was very rhythmic thumping sound. It sounded as if it was coming through the rock table that the hogan sits on top of. I tried to rationalize it and told myself it was just the cows and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up the next morning and we went to check the cows, which were about 10 miles away on the ranch and hadn't been anywhere near our hogan that night. Several days later, after I told my aunts about what had happened, they told me that my one Navajo grandma, who lived alone out in the middle of nowhere, had weird things happen to them too. The same night we had her door kicked, someone also knocked on her door in the middle of the night. When she opened the door, there was no one there. My aunts think it's a skinwalker who is messing with me and my cousins because we're mixed race. I'm not sure that's the reason why, but I don't really know what to think of it. I work as a national park ranger in the northern part of the United States. The job is surprisingly difficult. We have to maintain the property, enforce the rules, and etc. One of the biggest things that they never tell you is that we're also responsible for missing people. People go missing all the time, especially at night. I remember getting a call once early in the morning saying that they heard gunshots coming from a campsite. Unfortunately, I had to respond. It was still dark outside when we pulled up to the campsite. The campsite consisted of 2 RVs that looked destroyed. Blood was everywhere. We got out of our vehicle to investigate with our weapons drawn. We announced our presence and we continued to the campsite. There was no one there. There had been cases before where people left their food out, which drawn bears or mountain lions, and unfortunately caused the death of the campers. But this case was different. Typically, when an animal attacks a camper, there's at least something left over, a body part or something. But in this case, there was nothing, just blood. Upon further investigation, we were able to discover that there were some bullet holes in some of the walls of the RV. Typically, when campers are armed, they are able to fend off animals quite well. Unfortunately, in this scenario, that doesn't seem to be the case. I didn't stay too long at the scene. Something in the back of my mind told me that those things were still out there, and I didn't want to meet them. I went back to the station and reported my findings. When I arrived at the station, I was quite surprised to see that the local authorities were already there, alongside another organization I couldn't quite recognize. They looked official. They looked much like your men in black that your typical conspiracy theorist would talk about. White shirts, black jackets, and sunglasses. Before I was able to enter the station, one of the men in black approached me. The man identified himself quite bravely and told me that I had to ride with him into their headquarters. Initially, I refused. I told him that I had to report what I saw. This seemed to disturb him. He said that that wouldn't be necessary and that I had to go down to the station with him immediately. Before I was able to respond a second time, my lead ranger came out, aka my boss, of the station and told me that I had to go with them. I did as they requested and got into the van. About 2 hours later, we arrived at their headquarters. The headquarters were this unidentified building in a downtown city that I'm not going to name. The building was quite large. We entered the building and I was taken to a conference room. While in there, I was interviewed by a couple of people and asked me odd questions. They asked me if I saw anything, if I heard anything, or even if I smelled anything. I told them the truth, which really wasn't much, that I only saw blood and a couple of bullet holes. They seemed somewhat relieved by this answer. They then told me that they were taking over the investigation and that I was not to talk about anything that I saw that morning. If I said anything to anyone, I could possibly lose my job and even face time in jail. I didn't really understand the big deal about this. Campers get attacked by animals all the time. Why was the government interested in this single attack? I was then taken back to my station. By this time, it was almost the end of the day. I drove my service truck over to the campsite that I was at earlier. The 2 RVs that were there earlier were gone. That was quite strange to me. Typically, when something like this happens, the scene is not to be disturbed for at least a couple of days. This allows for a proper investigation, but it looked like someone just wanted to clean up the area as if nothing happened. For some reason, this bothered me, but I didn't say anything to anyone. 3 weeks later, I get another call. Very similar scenario, except I'm able to get there in time. I pull up to the campsite and I'm able to hear gunfire. I draw my weapon and I follow the sounds. The gunfire is coming from inside a trailer. In the break of the gunfire, I'm able to announce my presence and I tell them to stop shooting. The people inside the trailer then yell something that really disturbs me. They tell me to shoot the girl and that it's not human. I tell them to stop firing so that we can sort all of this out. I figure that they're either on drugs or they're drunk. Again, something that I'm not completely foreign to. I try to shine my flashlight around to see what they're shooting at, and my heart stops. Off into the distance, I'm able to see the silhouette of a little girl, except something's not right. She's shaking. A lot. It's as if she's having a seizure. My first thought is that this little girl is in great danger. Not only are these people shooting at her, but she's having a seizure. I go knock on the trailer and I tell them to stop shooting. They open the door to the trailer and I see that there's a family inside. Everyone is crying except for the father figure, who is still holding his gun. I enter the trailer and they quickly close it behind me. I call for other rangers to come to the scene, and I ask the family what's going on. They're all quite hysterical, and they aren't making much sense. They're saying that something took their dog, and that the thing that took it is able to change shapes. I wait with the family until more rangers arrive. I'm quite skeptical at what they're saying. When more rangers finally arrive, I tell them that there's a little girl out in the woods and that she's possibly injured. I take the family back to the station, and again, those men in black people are there waiting. Instead of taking me back to their headquarters, they call all of the rangers inside. They then inform us that all of us are being relocated, and that this national park would be closing for a very short time. What bothers me most about this experience is that it leaves me with so many questions. What was going on in that national park? What was that organization doing? And what was that little girl doing out in the woods? I am a police officer in a town in Arizona. Our town borders a Navajo reservation. Like most reservations, we have no jurisdiction on it, but that's not the reason why we don't go. Since our town borders the reservation, we have gotten many calls from our townspeople saying that they've seen strange things on their lands. We have gotten many UFO calls, which there's obviously nothing that we can do about it, but we have also gotten strange calls of creatures lurking into people's windows. The calls vary in description of the creatures. Some say it looks like a Bigfoot, while others say it's a creature with antlers. Regardless of the call, we still have to go out and make a report, and we get these calls about once a week. 90% of the time, the reports lead to nothing. But every now and then, either myself or another officer will see something strange. Something I'm going to share with you that's currently ongoing is often referred to by me and many officers as the Screaming House. Allow me to provide some context about this case. The driveway to the Screaming House is about a mile long. The mailbox and driveway are technically in our town, but the house itself isn't. Since the mailbox is in our town, we have to respond to the calls. The Screaming House isn't owned by anyone. No one lives there, but we get calls every week or so from that residence of someone screaming into the phone. All of the calls are at late at night. The call started about 6 months ago. Me and my partner responded to the first call. The call happened at 1:16 in the morning. My partner and I were out there by 1:40. We pulled up to the mailbox and looked down the long dirt driveway. About halfway down the driveway, we noticed a fallen tree covering the path, so we'd have to get out. We pulled our police cruiser up as close as we could and got out. We were able to see the house and that there were no lights on. Not a great sign. We walked down the other half of the driveway, not exactly sure what to expect. The house had 2 stories and was very old. The house was definitely built in the early 1900s. In front of the house was an old rusted over truck from the 1930s. My partner and I stopped about 70 yards in front of the house. We shined our flashlights all over the property and the house, not seeing anyone. The front door to the house was wide open. How did we get a call from this place? I thought to myself. We walked a couple yards closer, and that's when we heard it. It wasn't the screaming that we heard on the phone, but rather the crying of a baby. Something isn't right, my partner said. There's no way there's a baby out here. This smells like a trap. I was conflicted. I wasn't sure whether to investigate or just to head back. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate the house. What if there was an actual toddler that made its way out here and was lost? I would never be able to forgive myself. We decided that I would check the house while my partner would check the perimeter of the outside. I entered the front door of the house, my flashlight peering into the dark house. The crying was coming from the basement. I made my presence known, announcing my name and that I was a police officer. I got no response, and the crying continued. The floor in the house was covered with glass and other debris. The floor crunched as I made my way through the house. I then quickly found the entrance to the basement. The basement door was missing. I shined my flashlight down and I saw an old set of stairs. The stairs looked as if they would not hold my body weight. I again made my presence known. The crying stopped. I was about to enter the basement when my partner buzzed me on the walkie. "John, you need to get out of there, now." I was confused and caught off guard. That's when I heard someone moving around upstairs. I bolted out of the house and down the driveway. My partner was already by the car. His gun was drawn and pointed behind me. We need to go, he said. I jumped in the cruiser and backed the cruiser out of the driveway. The entire time, my partner was asking, "Did you see it? Did you see it?" "No, I didn't see it," I said. We made our way back to the station, the entire time my partner telling me what he saw. He said that when he was in the backyard, he heard something behind him. He shined his flashlight around and noticed something upstairs. He said that he was only able to notice its eyes and its teeth. Everything else was just black fur. Now, we do have bears in Arizona, but not in our part of the state. However, on our report, we put the creature as a bear. My partner and I both know that whatever it was, it definitely wasn't a bear. Had my partner not notified me in time, I hate to imagine what would have happened. We still get calls from the screaming house, but we just drive by. We don't ever get out and investigate. We have a pretty good idea what kind of creature lives there, but I'm not going to call it by its name. I hear that it attracts them, and that's the last thing we need. I don't know what to make of my situation, but I want your opinion on what's going on. I had recently purchased some property out in the middle of nowhere. I had been looking for property for some time because I wanted to get into farming, but I hadn't had any luck until recently. But things are starting to make sense now that I'm looking back. I had purchased a couple 100 acres for a great deal. It's one of those deals that you do not believe what you're seeing. It's that good. I remember asking the realtor why it was such a great deal, but he never did give me a direct answer. That should have been a red flag. But I do remember him saying something about the nighttime, that it wasn't safe. I wasn't exactly sure what he meant, but now I do. A couple months ago when we first moved in, my wife and I pulled up in our vehicles, her in her minivan with our kids and me with the U-Haul towing my truck. The property had a small home on it, but the home looked like it hadn't been lived in for about 15 years. My wife saw this as something that we could make a project out of. She had always been very ambitious. I was the first one to pull up to the house. I got out of my U-Haul and I walked up to the front door. To my surprise, there laid a dead crow right in front of the door. The door had a small spattering of blood on it. The poor thing probably had flown into the door and died. This is something you normally see more on a window, not necessarily a solid door. But whatever. This wasn't an issue at the time, and it didn't raise any flags. Birds fly into things all the time and die. I then began to unpack the U-Haul. About 20 minutes or so later, my wife and our daughters finally arrived. Luckily, they didn't have to see the dead crow in front of the door. They were none the wiser. With my wife and daughter's help, we were able to finish unpacking the U-Haul just under an hour. The house had plumbing, but we were waiting on the electric company to turn on the switch. Something I should have done before, I know. We spent the rest of the day placing furniture all throughout the house. Nighttime came pretty quickly. That tends to happen when you're busy. Thankfully, my wife has a small candle collection that we use to light the home. Most of them were scented candles, but whatever. My daughters were enjoying the new house. They were both able to get their own rooms, and didn't seem to care that the house creaked often and smelled kind of funny, which I appreciated. Nothing happened the first night. I think it was because we didn't have electricity, and they didn't know we were there. The second day, we were able to get the electricity going. This was awesome for me because I love my sports. My family and I went into the nearest town and got supplies for the week. The town was about 20 minutes or so away, and we only seemed to pass maybe 1 or 2 houses on the way there. I even remember turning to my wife saying, "Man, we're really out there, aren't we?" By the time we were on our way back, the sun was beginning to set. We pulled in our driveway, which was about a half-mile long, and looked down to our house. I could see from that distance that every light in our house was on. I was a little freaked out about this. My wife and I are big sticklers about wasting energy. My daughters would leave a light on or so from time to time, but nothing like this. We got to the house and I slowly inspected it. All the doors and windows were locked, so we figured it was just the electric company rebooting all the lights. Again, this was no red flag, or for any cause of alarm. We go inside and everything seems to be in order. We unload the groceries and go in for the night. During the night, however, around 1 or 2 in the morning, I could hear howling off into the distance. Whatever the creature was, it was definitely a good distance away. I was planning on using the land for cattle farming, but I didn't have any cattle at the time, so I really didn't care about the wolves. Around the same time of the howling, I could have sworn I heard something at the front door. It wasn't enough for me to get up and check, but it was enough for me to notice. The next morning, my wife and I got up early and began our projects on the house. My wife began to make coffee, and I went out to my car to grab my charger. When I opened the front door, there laid another dead crow. What? I thought. Why do crows love this door? Or better yet, why does this door hate crows? Again, I just kicked the crow off the front porch. Not a big deal. But I did take notice. Maybe it was the thud I heard last night. That was kinda weird. Oh well. I went out to my truck and grabbed my charger and went back in, not telling my wife what was in front of our door. I had some coffee and we started the day off right. Quick note about our land. The land I purchased was mostly flat, except for a small hill that our house was on. The house had a very old barn around back. It wasn't very big and it didn't have a door. Next to the barn was an old well that was no longer in use. I wanted to fill the old well, but I didn't have time, thanks to all these house projects. The day went by pretty quickly again. My wife and I were busy for the most part, while our daughters played around the house. Around 7 o'clock at night, I needed to go into town to buy an extension cord. I was driving away from my house on our half-mile driveway when my lights scanned across the open field in front of me, a couple 100 yards away, on these large animals. The animals had very dark fur, and instead of reflecting green like most animals, their eyes reflected red. Oh my gosh, I said out loud. That's kinda spooky. I continued driving, hoping that I'd get a better look at these animals, but I never got a better look. I continued my way to the hardware store and picked up whatever it was I was going to get. While I was there, I got a phone call from my wife. She was pretty frantic. She was saying something about growling coming from outside. My mind flashed to what I saw earlier, and I quickly left the store. I got home in record time. Once I was home, I did a quick once-over outside and didn't find anything. I then went inside. I found my wife and our 2 daughters hiding upstairs in the bathtub. Okay, I know that animals can be scary sometimes, but come on, hiding in the bathtub? My wife was pretty insistent that whatever it was trying to get inside. I told her and my daughters that it was very important that we made sure we did not keep any food outside. They agreed, and they seemed to calm down after coming up with this simple solution. But my wife still seemed petrified. It was clear that she wanted to tell me something, but not in front of my daughters. She waited until our daughters were asleep in bed when she told me what she had heard. She told me that right when I left, she thought she heard me out in the backyard. She was confused since she saw me leave and drive off. She walked back there to see if she could see me, but obviously she didn't. That's when she heard what she thought was me again, this time coming from the old barn. She knew that whatever it was speaking wasn't me. My wife then quickly went inside, locking all the doors and windows and taking my 2 daughters upstairs. Okay, that's a little bit more freaky, I said. My wife and I then argued about calling the police to come check out the backyard. I felt silly about it. We're gonna tell the police to come over because my wife thought she heard me in the backyard? We didn't call the police that night, but we did settle on calling them the next morning. My wife and I then went to bed since we had a big day ahead of us. I woke up again in the middle of the night. My daughter was standing next to my bed, shaking me awake. "What's wrong, dear?" I said sleepily. She then told me that there was a scary man outside. I got out of bed and gave her a hug. "It's okay, dear. I know a new house can be scary sometimes," I said reassuringly. "Let me see if I can see him," I said to my daughter as I carried her back to her bed. I carried her back to her room and I looked out her window, being more than confident that I would not see any scary man out there. As I was quickly scanning the horizon, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a large silhouette. I naturally did a double take. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was no man, but it did stand up like one. Whatever it was, it greatly resembled the creatures that I saw earlier that week. Its eyes reflecting red. The creature then began to walk around my house, no longer in my view. "Did you see it, Daddy?" my daughter asked. No, I didn't see anything. There's nothing out there," I lied, hoping to calm my daughter as well as myself. My daughter didn't question it and went back to bed. I slowly crept into another room, hoping to get another view of that creature, but I couldn't see it. My mind was now racing. What was that thing I saw? It looked like a wolf, but again, it was standing like a man. Not just like any man, but a man trying not to be seen. I didn't sleep well that night. 9 o'clock the next day, I called the police and told them that we had suspicion of people trespassing on my property. The police took their sweet time to finally get to my house, and when they finally arrived, they didn't exit the cruiser. They apologized for being so late and told me that they thought it was a prank and had to reconfirm the address. "Why would it be a prank?" I said. The policeman then said, "Look, I don't know if you know this or not, but the previous owners of this property were killed. Their bodies were mutilated and dumped into the well out back. That was 20 years ago. The case is still open." He also then told me that the property that I live on had been bought and sold dozens of times, mainly due to the real estate agency not giving enough information about the property's history. The new owners then find out and are outraged and sell the property again. That explains why the property was so cheap. I don't know what was more sickening, seeing that creature last night or hearing this information. I thanked the officers for their time and they left. I told my wife what they told me and we had a discussion. I also told her about the thing that I saw last night. She thinks that whatever it was trying to mimic me behind the barn and the creature that I saw last night probably had something to do with the murders. That day, we decided that we needed to pack up and go and stay in a motel. That brings us to now. We don't know what to do and we're losing money fast. Everything we had was tied up into that farm. If we cannot figure out a solution, we will have to be forced to go back to the barn and stay there. I was 15 at the time and roughly the same age of my cousins and brother at the time. We were all within 1 year of each other. We go into the woods to be manly and do whatever guys do. We have normal supplies, axe, hatchet, knives, matches, you name it. It's getting late in the woods and we were extra manly since we were 15, but we decided to head back because the bugs are kinda too much. On our way back, there's a pretty androgynous looking person on our trail, just standing there with torn clothes. "Hey, are you lost? We can lead you out if you want." This person starts doing this dry heaving motion like they were dry heaving but lifting their elbows too. Very unnatural looking. I say to the person, "What are you doing?" Whatever it was stops heaving. It opens its mouth and lets out this scream. It's unlike anything I have ever heard before. Normally, I would have ran away, but there was about 15 of us and we all had small weapons. We just stand our ground and lift our weapons up in defense mode. The thing cricks its head unnaturally towards us like they do in almost every possessed movie and smiles at us. We all scream to get away from us and sure enough, whatever it was did. Once the creature was out of our sight, we instantly stopped hearing any of the noises that came from it. It was as if it was still hiding behind a tree, waiting for anyone to come around looking for it. At this point, however, we were pretty spooked and we decided to get out of there. It was about 3 weeks until I finally went back into the woods. My wife asks me to go camping. I hate the idea, but she's pretty excited. Sure, why not? We drive to a secluded bit of land by her grandparents' house. We spend hours setting up the tent in the campsite. We get ready and go hiking. As we are hiking, however, it rains a little bit and we get a bit wet. We double back and get back just in time before it gets dark. We make a fire and the wife is getting a little bit tired, kinda low energy. We eat dinner and talk for a while, then we decide it's time to go to bed. We inflate our air mattress and get our double sleeping bag out. We get in together and she's shivering. I ask her, is she okay? And she says that she's fine. She keeps shivering and I don't feel good about this. You said you were fine. I don't want to ruin our trip or anything, but I think we should go back. I feel her face, and it's pretty hot. Well, it won't be any fun if you don't feel well tomorrow. I think it'd be better if we just leave. You might have a fever. She agrees and we head back to our home. As we decide to get our things packed up, I put her in the car to wait as I finish putting the tent and other odds and ends back into the car. I turn the car on and place her inside. I turn the heat on high so she can get warm. I go back into the tent and start to deflate the air mattress when I hear the horn beeping from outside. I run out over to the car and my wife says that there was someone around in our campsite. She said that they were crawling. She said that as soon as she saw them and was sure it was a person, she made sure to beep the horn to notify me. I can tell she's pretty upset about this. I didn't believe her at the time, considering the state that she was in. I tell her to relax and rest up as I finish up packing. I gather everything outside the tent and step back in to roll up the mattress. I hear her yell my name. It sounded like it came from the woods. Why is she outside of the car? I then hear her yell, "Help me, my leg is bleeding." I rush out and I glance over to the car, but she's still inside, asleep. A wave of fear washes over me and I hear something yell again from the woods. This time it doesn't sound anything like my wife.
"Help me."
I begin to freak out and instead of packing up the tent properly, I just roll it up as best I can and shove it into the car. I left a few unimportant items behind considering I was in a rush and I didn't want to meet whatever it was out in the woods. I start driving and we finally make it home. When my wife finally wakes up, I ask her, "What did you see out in the woods?" She gets really serious and looks very stern in her face. She said that it was very white and thought it was a naked person crawling behind some trees. She then saw them stand up against the tree and began to beep the horn to get my attention. Then, whatever it was, got down on all fours again and took off crawling into the woods. In a way, I'm kind of glad that my wife got sick, so that we would not be outside any longer with that thing. Back in 2012, we always had bonfires every night. I'm in the Marine Corps Reserve, so while I'm at home, I work as an Ohio State trooper. Anyways, a bunch of my buddies and I were having a bonfire. We got everyone at my house around 7 p.m., then loaded them up into our vehicles. Mine was a Chevy Suburban, and the others were a Jeep Wrangler and a Ford 350. The spot where we have our bonfires was a mile back on my land. There was this dirt path we would take to get to this cabin. It starts going out in between two fields, then through the woods, then dead ends at our cabin, which overlooks this creek. We had about 24 people packed into these 3 vehicles. We set off driving through the woods, and for my Chevy, it's no big deal. But as soon as we got to the area, I stepped out of my vehicle and I could smell this awful smell. Death. It smelled like death, like an animal or something was rotting in the woods somewhere nearby. Everyone else said that they could smell it too. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe a deer had died or something. This story took place near the end of September, so hunting season had just started. I started the fire and didn't think too much of the smell. We all eventually got used to it. We played beer pong and had a generator going to power the cabin. So my friend of mine, Ryan, had been telling me that this girl I had brought with me kept asking stuff about me to him, saying how much of a gentleman I was and how that we were probably going to hook up that night. Anyways, the fire was dying down, so Ryan was going to get wood with a few buddies of mine. I had them take a radio with them to radio me if they needed any help. The fire started to get real low. It had been about 30 minutes since they had left. "Hey, where are your fruitcakes at?" I asked over the radio. "Dude, chill, I'm on my way," Ryan responded. They came back later with a ton of wood, got the fire going again, and eventually it started to get late. People wanted to start going home, so after everyone left, there were only 8 of us that had remained. The girl I liked, Sarah, Ryan, David, another guy, and 3 other girls. David, the other guy, and the girls were wasted and they were flirting all night. I continued to chill at the fire with Sarah and Ryan talking about some random stuff. It started to get real late, around 2 a.m., and when the 3 girls, David, and the other guy wanted to lay down in the cabin, Sarah and I stayed outside and talked for a while. Eventually, we started to make out. I stopped when I heard this crackling sound outside. I looked over and I couldn't make out what the figure was walking around near the tree line. "Hey you, what are you doing over there?" I asked. "Dude, chill, I'm on my way," the figure responded. It sounded exactly like Ryan, but I swore that Ryan had been in the cabin this whole time. Maybe he had walked out when I was occupied and didn't see him when he went out. "What?" I asked. "Dude, chill, I'm on my way," it responded again. My hair started to raise up on my neck. "What the heck?" Sarah responded. "Sarah, go inside and wake everyone up," I responded. She didn't hesitate. I walked over to my SUV and popped the trunk and grabbed my AR-15. For some reason I was shaking, and the death smell was back again. "What the heck?" I whispered to myself, shoving the mag into the rifle and sending a round into the chamber. I walked around the SUV to where I saw the figure in the woods, and I couldn't see it. About this time, Ryan had walked out of the cabin and looked at me like I was a stupid. "Dude, why do you have a gun?" he asked. "Were you out in the woods?" I asked him. He told me that he'd just woken up and had no idea what I was talking about. I told him to take everyone back to their cars and come back with a gun. He got everyone into their SUVs and drove off. I sat there by the fire for a while, looking around. I had my spotlight with me at my side, the 1,000,000 kilowatt powered one. I couldn't help but think that there was someone in the woods trying to play a trick on me, but living 8 miles away from a prison, you can't really be too sure. The death smell was starting to get almost repugnant. I almost felt like gagging. I had something walking around in the woods again, and I grabbed my spotlight and stood up. I waited for a moment, then I saw it again. The figure walked out of the woods and stood there looking at me. I flipped on the light and pointed it at it. Whatever this thing was, its back was facing me, and it was facing the forest. "Hey, I got a gun. You might want to tell me what you're doing in my land before I lay you out right now." Not a single word came from this person's mouth. I started to walk closer and I heard the words, "Dude, why do you have a gun?" come from this person. "Well, because I stopped mid-sentence. I started to think about what it just said. It sounded just like Ryan. It was as if it was mimicking him, but perfectly. It repeated it again, and this time it sounded exactly like Ryan. I raised my rifle and sighted it in on this guy. "Ryan?" I asked. The neck shifted a little bit and twitched its whole body. It looked unnatural. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about it looked wrong. I heard music playing in the background, and I could see headlights coming through the woods. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure turned around and looked at me. Its facial features were off. It looked like the other guy that was with Ryan, but its voice sounded exactly like Ryan, and it stared at me with its mouth wide open. "Who are you?" I shouted, flipping off my rifle's safety. Something on the fire snapped and made a loud noise, so I flipped around to see what was behind me. When I looked back to the woods, the person was gone. "Frick!" I shouted, looking around for him. About this time, Ryan was parking the Suburban and getting out, putting a pistol in his back waistband. "Dude, what's going on?" he asked. I started to fill him in on everything, then asked if everyone was with him. He told me that everyone was in the cabin, was in the SUV, the other guy, Sarah, and the 3 girls. We sat by the fire and started waiting. The death smell had went away for the time being. It was around 4 a.m. now, and the sunlight should be coming through just in a couple of hours. At that time, however, the death smell came back, this time stronger than ever, to the point Ryan gagged and almost threw up. I got up and looked around, waiting to see the figure again. A few moments passed and I could see something on the ground, coming out of the woods. I turned on my spotlight and shined it at the figure. The man, who I had seen before, was on the ground, rolling around. "What the F is that?" Ryan asked, pulling his pistol out from his back waistband. We both stared at the man rolling around for a good 20 minutes, then stopped, and lay there on the ground. The man then started to twitch. I started walking towards the man, having my rifle pointed at him the entire time. I got about 30 meters away and he stopped twitching. He stood up and looked at me. All of a sudden, I had felt this feeling of absolute dread. I felt like everything I knew about my life was about to come to an end. I then took action and fired one bullet into the man's forehead. The man drops like a bag of rocks on the ground and starts twitching. What happened next, I cannot explain. The man stood up and started walking to the woods like nothing had happened. I lowered my rifle and watched as he made it into the tree line and turned around and looked at us. Maybe I'd missed, I thought. I didn't see any wound on him and nothing on his face was touched. When the man left, the death smell went away. I couldn't smell it anymore. The man smiled at us and walked into the woods again. By that time, we ran and got into the SUV, got in and took off towards my home. We never spoke of what happened to anyone in fear that they think we were mental. I've been back to that place countless times, but I cannot seem to forget that smell of death, or that feeling of dread. I'm not sure if it was the goat man or a skinwalker, a ghost maybe, or a wendigo, but whatever it was, I sure hope that it went somewhere else. We've never spoken about this particular event, not even among ourselves after it happened. It was with my friends Ben and Ryan and myself going camping into the woods like we used to do when we got a weekend off, or at least used to do before this. In general, we try to go to new places. There was this one forest in particular situated 2 hours away from our city that we've been told about. We've been putting it off for a while because it was said to be dangerous, packed with wild animals that would attack campers often. Ben, in his usual part of trying to be a badass, said he would take out his shotgun and we'd be safe. Ryan was a bit of a wimp, but he agreed, so we drove there as soon as we were able to when we had a free weekend. We got there by mid-afternoon. After we set up camp and the night was beginning to set in, we decided to go out for a walk. We secured our stuff and Ben took out his shotgun in case any animals approached us, and we started following a small path that got deeper into the woods. Walks in the dark like these would always relax me, but this time I was starting to feel uneasy. Something was off. About half an hour of walking, we started to hear noises getting closer to us. They sounded like footsteps of several big creatures closing in on us, but to this day I swear I could also hear soft whispers beneath the noises. Feeling like cornered animals, in total panic, we began running back through the path that we had come on. During this, I somehow lost Ben and Ryan, and we could not even see their flashlights in the distance. I kept on, running crapless. At some point, I ran past an old house, which seemed to have suffered a fire. The windows were boarded up, but the door seemed to be half open. Suddenly, I heard something coming from inside. Terrified at first, I froze, but then I realized it was actually Ryan, calling for me to come inside. I was doubtful at first, for some reason, but as soon as I heard the animal sounds coming closer to me, I bolted into the house and closed the door. I lifted my flashlight to look around, and there was Ryan. I pointed the light to his eyes, but he didn't seem to react much to it. In fact, he seemed really calm, which was odd for him. "Let's stay here for now," he said, in a relaxed tone of voice. "Those things out there could be dangerous." Now I was worried about Ben, but remember that worst case scenario he had a shotgun, ready if anything attacked him. I took a deep breath and started looking around the room. The few chairs that were laying on the floor looked charred, and in one corner of the room there was a pile of sticks with a bunch of stones scattered around them. All of a sudden, we hear Ben's gun go off twice. I stood there paralyzed, as every other sound in the forest stopped. I glanced briefly at Ryan and he was just looking at me, completely quiet. I was about to say something when suddenly someone started banging on the door. Ryan immediately grabbed my shoulders and said, "Don't open that door. It could be one of those things." I started walking towards the door and he insisted, "Don't do it. They're gonna kill us." This really unsettled me, but I was afraid it could be Ben, who had just shot one of those wild animals and was looking for shelter. I grabbed on the metal door handle and took a deep breath, and as Ryan was still talking behind me, I opened the door. A cold chill ran down my spine. Standing there in front of me was Ryan. It didn't sink in at first as he was saying, "Hey man, did you hear Ben's gun go off too? I think we needed to find him and get the hell out of there." I babbled something incomprehensible and slowly turned around, pointing my flashlight all over the room. Nobody was there. When the light reached the corner of the room, I realized what I had been looking at earlier. It was a pile of bones, and around them, forming a circle, were a bunch of skulls. Human skulls. We ran off as fast as we could and found Ben near the campsite. When he saw us, he was pale and did not say a word. We got in my truck and drove off, and we left the place, leaving all of our stuff behind. On the way back, after a long silence, I asked Ben what he shot at. Some of those things came from behind in the trees and attacked me. I shot them down. Ben, what were those things? It was you guys. I killed you both back there. The rest of the way back, nobody spoke a word. We never saw Ben again. It was the last summer that we all had together. We, being me and a small group of my friends from high school. There was me, my boyfriend, and 4 of our mutual friends. So things didn't get confusing, I'm going to name my boyfriend Lee and my 4 friends, Allie, Harris, Landon, and Kathy. It was originally me and my boyfriend's plan, just the 2 of us going up to his parents' summer house in a nice rural area. Our friends got wind of it and decided to join in since it sounded like fun. It would also be one of the last times we would be able to meet together as a friend group. The summer home was very pretty. It was very rustic. It had these big open windows lining all the walls, so during the daytime, lights were not necessary. There were no electronics, but the entertainment wasn't an issue because there was this awesome lake not too far from the place, and of course, we also had each other. We made sure everyone had a few days free from work and whatnot. We took off and we packed up all of our big comfy pillows and blankets, as well as some stuff for s'mores and hot dogs. We took our good friend Harry's rig up. It was this clunker van and it had a lot of room in it, so that's why we took it. It had rained the day before and the dirt driveway leading to the summer home was all muddy, so we decided just to leave the car and carry all of our stuff up to the house. Once we got inside, we pretty much just dumped all of our stuff on the floor of the living room. We wanted to get down to the lake while the water was still warm. The sun was going to set soon and we wanted as much time in the lake as possible. There wasn't a lot of people there. It was just 2 old guys with their kids fishing on a boat. Everyone was in the water at one point, except for Harris and Landon, who were just chilling on the dock. We were all just having fun fighting over inflatable rafts and whatnot, when Landon yelled, "Hey, there's someone over there in the woods." I propped myself up on the raft and saw what appeared to be a half-naked guy standing in the woods a little ways away from us. I can't really remember facial features, but I do remember his eyes. They were very dark and glittery, like they reminded me of a fox or something. From what I remember, he was very tan and had black hair. He was obviously an aboriginal. Most of all though, I remember his eyes. They seemed to shine. Kinda like those pictures when you see of animals and their eyes glow from the camera flash. I assumed he was a swimmer, maybe with the old guys who were already there early. I yelled at him and asked if he wanted to join us, but he just stood there, stiffly. He didn't move. It would almost be like he didn't even notice us if it wasn't for the fact that he was staring right at us. I remember Lee yelling at him if he was okay, but he still didn't answer. Harris is a big guy, a big, irritable guy. He shouted at the guy to stop standing in the woods like a pervert. The guy still didn't react. He just stood there with only beige shorts on. Lee thought maybe he was on drugs or something. He got really uncomfortable and suggested that we leave. I agreed fully. The guy was really creeping us all out. We all clambered out of the lake and wrapped ourselves up in these towels and headed our way back to the cabin. The trail back to the summer house was uphill and gave us a good vantage point of the guy. He was still standing down by the lake, still stiff and awkward looking, except for his head. His head was turned as far as it could be to the side, watching us. Landon is pretty skittish and he started to curse at us and telling us to go faster. Harris said that he was probably just retarded or something, and that if he attacked, that he could take him. We all went inside the summer house, under the guise of wanting to organize our stuff that we dumped on the floor, but I think we just didn't want to go outside again while that guy was still out there poking around. We do all we can inside, and it starts to get dark out. Allie volunteers to go outside with Landon to go dig a fire pit. Harris tags along, and Lee says that he's going out into the woods to get some dead branches and stuff, and that I would go with him. Kathy said that she'd go looking for kindling, but I think she was still kind of freaked out. Anyway, me and Lee were out in the woods. He's getting firewood and some sticks to roast the food on. I'm stuck carrying the wood since he's the one cutting it up. The mosquitoes are eating us alive, and all I hear is this buzzing. But the buzzing keeps getting louder and louder, until it feels like my skull is vibrating. I can't see and my teeth are chattering. Eventually it gets so bad that I drop the firewood and swat around my head. But that does nothing, so I just put my hands over my ears, but it feels like my hands are shaking too. It's then that I notice that I lost sight of Lee. I shout out to him, and as soon as the shout leaves my lips, I'm overcome with this violent stench. I can't even begin to describe it. It was so rancid and foul. I put my hands over my nose. It took all of my willpower to not hurl. I started to head back to the house when I catch something out of the corner of my eye. It's Lee. I feel really relieved to see him and start to walk towards him, about to make a joke about how he tried to ditch me, but he doesn't really react. He just stands there stiffly, without any real emotion in his face. His face is slack, like he'd forgotten how to smile or to make any emotion for that matter. His posture isn't relaxed like usual. He's very tense, like all of his muscles had cramps in them. My smile drops from my face, and he lets out this wheezing, gasping noise. His shoulders convulse up and down. It seems like he's trying to laugh, but it only comes out as a strange mockery. I felt so terrified. I turned on my heels, and it seemed all of my time on the track team finally paid off. I was running and jumping over branches, and the buzzing returned, joined by the frail, wheezing noise. I burst out of the tree line and bumped directly into Kathy, after what felt like an eternity. I remember she said, "Whoa, what happened?" But I was panting and shaking too much to answer. She brought me over to the campfire, which was started, and sat me next to Lee. He put his arms around my waist and started to pick the twigs out of my hair. "What happened?" he asked. I looked at him, confused and angry. "What do you mean? You left me in the woods." He seems perplexed. He then explains that he saw me clear as day heading back towards the house, and he followed me back wondering what was going on. When he got back, he said he didn't see me anywhere and the others didn't see me leave the woods. They were just going to look for me when I burst through the tree line after apparently running a marathon. "What happened anyway?" asked Landon. "Did you see a bear?" I wasn't sure if I was going crazy or not, but I was sure that I saw Lee. Now that I was back to relative safety, I began to doubt myself, but I told them anyway. I told them about the buzzing and how I thought I saw Lee. Allie said maybe I was just tired, and Harris agreed, mumbling something about mumbo jumbo. We decided to try to relax and make some s'mores. It was pretty dark by this time and the atmosphere seemed more lighthearted. We were all reminiscing about the old times and getting sticky from marshmallow goo. Landon took out his harmonica and started doing this funny old blues guy impression that he does. I was content and just laying there on Lee's lap, listening to everyone's banter, just kind of zoned out, when Landon stopped playing his harmonica. Everyone looked at him, expectantly. No matter how tired everyone was, we could all depend on Landon to be goofy, but now he was just sitting still as a statue, peering into the woods. "Guys, I think there's a coyote or a fox or something in there." Lee is this country guy and is used to these little critters like that, so he seems unmoved. He told Landon that it's probably just the smell from the food and that it would be easy to chase them off. Yeah, but this one looked big. Its eyes are high off the ground, I think. I feel myself tense up and look back into the woods. Lee snaps at Landon, telling Landon that he isn't funny and that he's trying to scare me. I tell him that it's okay, but I ask Landon to stop. Landon looks at me and swears that he isn't kidding, with no trace of his usual smart-ass smirk. He says maybe we should go inside in case it has rabies or something. We leave the fire going and go inside the house, intending to go outside again after a while. There are a few couches in the living room which face out of a big window towards our fire, so we all sit there to keep an eye on it. Harris growls at Landon that he better not be messing around, but Landon swears up and down that he isn't. We sit around for a while and our feeling of lightheartedness is gone. The fire starts to burn low when we see it. Kathy lets out this nervous squeak and a gasp. Eyes! 2 glowing eyes can be seen in the woods. The lights of the fire make them burn bright. Slowly, a shadowy figure makes its way out and towards the campfire. As it steps into the light, we notice it's the Aboriginal man from before. He moves forward slowly, like a wolf circling its prey, and crouches down by the fire. On closer inspection, we notice that he has no shoes on, and what we thought were his beige shorts were actually some kind of skin-wrapped loincloth around his waist. I hear Harris mutter, "Are you serious?" And I feel Lee's sweaty hands slide into my own. Allie whispers timidly, "He could be mentally ill," to which Landon replies, "Holy hell." The man paws around our stuff and goes to where Landon was sitting. I see the man reach for something on the ground, and his movements seem robotic-like he doesn't know how to extend his arms properly. I see something glint in his hands, and my first thought was, oh my gosh, is that a knife? But then I hear a long, high-pitched note of a harmonica. Landon makes a weird gulping noise, like he wants to laugh and cry at the same time. The man blows into the harmonica again, holding the same high-pitched note for about 20 seconds or so. He makes a few more circles around the campfire, his dark eye still glowing. He stops for a moment and looks into the windows. He stands there for a good 5 seconds before heading back into the woods. "Okay, what is this guy's deal?" Landon asks. Allie repeats that he could have some mental illness, but is now met by silence. Kathy looks extra nervous and has her knees pulled up into her chin, and she's shivering. I ask if she's okay. She starts to rub her eyes and her cheeks turn pink, like they always do right before she's about to cry. "I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned it earlier. I saw that guy earlier when we were walking up the driveway, but I didn't mention it. I didn't know. I didn't know." She breaks off into tears and repeats her mantra of "I didn't know." Harris pats her awkwardly on the head and tells her that she doesn't need to apologize for not assuming every half-naked guy in the woods is a creep. She shakes her head viciously and begins to ramble about some old Navajo legend and some weird beliefs. She tells us how she's scared and thinking of how her mother would tell her these stories of these unigloshes. Allie told her to be quiet and that she was only scaring herself. Lee goes through his bag and gives her this bottle of water. He covers her with his feathery blanket and tells her that she's okay. The fire is nearly burned out, and we decide that we won't be going out anymore that night. Harris and Lee go outside to grab our flashlights and the things that we left out in a hurry to get indoors. We pull all the cushions off the couches, which apparently double as beds. I'm in one bed with Lee beside me, and Landon is on the other side with Allie and Kathy. The sleeping arrangements are a bit more cramped than we intended, but we did not want to separate. I guess I fell asleep at some point because a loud clap of thunder woke me up. It was raining pretty hard now. The rain was coming down sideways like a thick sheet. "Hey, is anyone awake?" I whispered, but no reply. There was a flash of thunder and I can make out Allie and Kathy in Harris' sleeping forms. Lee has his arm around me and I pull up the blanket over my shoulders and snuggle closer to him. Another flash of lightning, and I see it. Those 2 green-yellow orbs lit up in the darkness, standing right at the huge ground-level window. The house goes dark again, but the light of those orbs are burnt into my retinas, and it seems everywhere I look for a couple of seconds, the orbs are there. Another flash of lightning, and I see the man walking along the side of the window. It goes dark again, then bright. He's now outside the window, at my feet. I nudge Lee awake and tell him not to move, that the man is circling the house and that he shushes me and kisses my ear, and the lightning flashes again. The man has made a full circle and is to my left again. "I think he's trying to get a rise out of us," Lee whispers. I asked him what we think we should do. "Stay still, I guess, and if he gets in, I'll have my buck knife under my pillow." Landon shifts beside us groggily and moans, "Keep it down, lovebirds, I'm trying to sleep." I tell Landon that he's an idiot and that the man is outside, and he groans. Landon and Lee have their eyes shut, I think. Mine are open to slits and the room lights up again. That's when I noticed it. This guy is inside. I guess Landon didn't have his eyes shut because he screamed at the same time as I did. Lee sits up holding his buck knife. "Listen, we don't want any trouble. Just leave us alone. Don't do anything crazy." The man is moving slowly forward, eyes glittering in the darkness. Lee stays still, unable to see in the darkness. The man opens and closes his mouth a couple of times in a choking growl, saying, "Trouble, trouble." His voice doesn't sound right. It gives me this sick, sinking feeling inside. It sounds like a scratchy record, maybe a parrot or something. The room lights up again and the man is nowhere to be seen. Harris and the others are sitting up now, bewildered. Lee is on his feet, pulling at his shirt. "This guy's in here, I know it." He brandishes his knife around. "We need to leave." My eyes are starting to adjust and I see the shape of Allie tilt her head. It's dark and we can't see anything out there, and it's pouring like crazy. Harris is now on his feet, reaching around in the darkness for a flashlight. I think he's the one that needs to leave, he growls, and makes his way to the kitchen, hatchet in hand. Lee follows closely behind, and noticing that they all took weapons, the rest of us follow. Kathy is sticking to me like glue. "This is what it wants," she mutters. "It's a game." We checked the house upstairs, every room, every closet. We didn't find anything. We all returned to the living room after that, trying to decide what to do. "It's gonna be morning soon," Harris says. "We'll leave as soon as we see the sun come out." I didn't want to stay there any longer, but blundering down the long, muddy driveway in the darkness was not an attractive idea either. We all settled back in. I think we all got scattered sleep except for Lee, who sat up the whole night keeping watch. Every time I drifted off, I found myself jolting awake again. Eventually, the sun rose, and outside was a bright and pink skyline that was beautiful. We hurriedly shoved our crap into our bags. My bladder felt like it was going to burst, and everyone else went outside. I asked Kathy to come to the side of the house with me so I could pee, because I was not going back in the house. She still looked a bit traumatized, her dark skin looking pale. She hugged her own shoulders. I squatted down to pee by the house and told her not to look. She didn't reply, but I didn't expect her to. I finished and stood back up, and I told her to come with me. She stood still, her arms crossed, looking at the ground. I started towards the others, peering around the corner. Kathy was sitting with the others, sitting on the stairs. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, and I turned around to see Kathy's doppelganger, her arms wrapped around her shoulders, shuddering. She lifted her upper lip in a weird sort of smile and sighed heavily. Mouth opening and closing, her breath hit me and I smelled it. It was that repugnant scent from before. I choked and she backed away slowly towards the tree line, staring into my eyes, not blinking. She choked out the words, "Come on," but halfway through saying that, her voice changed into what sounded like a fox, and she vanished off into the underbrush. I live in Arizona and I went camping with some friends in the Sedona area. One of the friends that I'm camping with has speech issues and they have some rotatism issues. They're not able to say their R's very well. Anyway, we went camping in this remote area. We were able to set up camp near this river since it is before mosquito season. My friend that has rotatism issues is a quiet type and just sort of falls into the background. Don't see much of him and everyone goes running around, exploring and swimming. It gets dark and things settle down. Rotatism guy is still not around, but no one is too worried. He is a grown man after all and he can take care of himself, and it's not even that late either. Rotatism guy finally shows up, takes a seat by the campfire and stares blankly into it. I ask him, is he okay? And he says, yes. I ask him where he was and he doesn't say anything. He had always been kind of aloof and quiet, so I just let it go. He's back and safe and that's all that matters. I start having fun again with my other friends, and I forget about the rotatism guy. He just sort of slips into the background as always. I go to bed and rotatism guy and the few others stay up. It felt good going to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. I got more and more restless and drifted in and out of consciousness. Kinda have to piss and thought maybe it would help me sleep. I get out of the tent and rotatism guy is still in the exact same spot. I am barely able to see him from the burned down coals. I nearly crapped myself. It was pretty creepy. I can't really describe it. He was just sitting there, completely still and just looking at the coals. He rubs his hands together and puts them near the fire pit, like he was trying to warm them with a big fire. Not sure what to do really. He turns and looks at me. Finally, I decide to say something. Maybe something freaked him out and he was just desperate to talk to someone. Maybe he saw a dead body or something and is now in a catatonic state. I start to calm down. Are you okay? It's like 4 a.m. Suddenly he stands up and starts talking. He seems to act cheery but can't seem to put enough emotion behind it. He begins to babble on for a few moments about the sun coming up soon and it's good that we were able to get a good hike before having to leave. He wants to go on a hike with me, like right that second. He doesn't want anyone else to come with us and even know that we're going. He doesn't even want me to change clothes or put on shoes. He gets more and more persistent. Suddenly I realize that he's pronouncing his words perfectly. The rotatism guy can speak perfectly for the first time in his life and has not messed up a single word since coming back from the woods. I then start to freak out. I say that I'm going to wake up the others. I go towards their tents and rattle them and yell at the friends to wake up. I make sure to never take my eyes off the rotatism guy. He just sits down and returns to his pose, just staring at the coals. Most of my friends get up, pretty pissed at me, obviously, but I don't really care about that. I say anything needed to keep them up and to stay around me. One guy complains that it's cold and talks about getting firewood. The rotatism guy offers to join him. Oh, I don't think so, I think to myself. I don't really know what to do in this situation. Should I out the rotatism guy and expose him as a Wendigo or a Fleshgate? Should I let my friend just go off and be taken by this guy? Like the retard that I am, instead of exposing this guy as a skinwalker, I decide to join them. The rotatism guy stares at me for a moment. Might have been a glare, might have been a calculating stare. Either way, I know that I just saved my friend's life. The rotatism guy follows us, slowly, like really creepily slow. Like it doesn't even fit with us. I make sure to stay by my friend's side and to keep an eye on the rotatism guy. My friend kinda gets the idea that something's up. He starts looking back and notices the rotatism guy too. We get the firewood, we get back, and I never take my eyes off of him. My friend does the same. He seems to get that rotatism guy is also acting weird, just staring blankly. Doesn't talk unless he's spoken to. Will do out-of-place actions, like he'll kneel down and put his shoelaces around like he's pretending to tie them. When we got back, I noticed that all the others went back to sleep because it was still pretty early in the morning. People start to wake up a couple hours later, and no one notices but me and my friend that the guy is acting very weird. He will randomly talk to others, trying to get them to go off into the woods alone with him. Thankfully, no one does since he was so weird about it. There's one example where the rotatism guy asked someone else if they wanted to go pee with him out in the woods. That's pretty creepy. A couple of hours later, we all begin to pack up and make our way back home. I'm driving. Once we get near Sedona, the rotatism guy asks to be let out. He says he's gonna walk the rest of the way home. This guy lives in Phoenix. It's a 2-hour drive. I let him out and do not give any cares. I just want him out of my car. Others seem pretty confused, and I don't care either. He gets out and we drive off. As we drive off, he just stares at us. He doesn't move, just twitches a little bit. I make a turn and I can't see him anymore. Immediately tell the others what had happened. Slightly scared that he'll jump out and start going gorilla on the car or something, but nothing. Others comment that he was being weird but still don't agree with me leaving him. Can't seem to convey that he was acting very weird. No one but the friend that went to get firewood with us believes me. He does not speak up much. I decide to drop it. I get back to work and the rotatism guy doesn't show up for a few days. When he does get back, I stay away from him. Eventually, I end up talking to him. He's pretty pissed at all of us considering that we left him out there. I yell at him for being so creepy, and besides, he asked to be let out. More arguing about the facts until I get it. He claims that on the first day, I took him out into the woods to show him something. We walked for hours and then I disappeared. Then he was lost in the woods for the entire day. I then realized something led my rotatism friend out into the woods and left him there in order to take his place with us. That was not my rotatism friend that spent the night with us. I never speak of it again and never tell the rotatism guy my side of the story. I was participating in a reenactment one year. This was a Vietnam one, so I had my AR-15 alongside several extra blank loaded magazines. It was getting very dark, and most of the crowd had left. We talked to the group's captain and he recommended a night practice, basically a patrol in this abandoned cornfield. It sounded fun, so I said yes. After the first 2 scenarios were done, I was placed on the opposing force side. I went off into the woods and waited. That's when I noticed that it was dead silent. All that could be heard was the occasional gust of wind through the dead stalks of corn. I glanced around the forest. Then I crawled out when the wind started up again. 2 loud cracks then filled the air, and I watched as the opposing force walked out of the cornfield with his weapon held up. This was followed by something standing up near the cornfield, firing again. Now, if you've never shot at night, it's a sight to see. The sudden light of the gun's flash makes everything freeze. It's to the point that you can quickly survey the area after a shot is fired, or so you think. Anyways, he soon shot as well, so I continued into the cornfield and lie down in a nice spot, hoping they'll come my way. I rest my rifle in a nice spot on my shoulder, and everything goes quiet. That's when I hear a deep breathing beside me. I slowly turn my head, looking to my right. It's dark as hell, so I can't see a dang thing. I could use my light, but that would give away my position, and I was not about to do that. I peer through the blanket of darkness, seeing what looked like fur. I slowly roll over to my side and drew my knife, just in case it was a dog or something that wanted to fight me. Something then moved in front of me. I quickly readjusted but missed what it was. When I glanced back to where the breathing was, I saw a bare space. I soon got up and moved. Somewhat shaken at this point, that's when I heard another 2 cracks, along with the captain laughing. I walked right into his line of fire. That was it. The game was done. His next idea was to use the woods only. Okay, sounds fun. I loaded up a fresh mag and followed him in. I was at the back, in case they tried to flank the rear. After a few minutes of walking, I heard some rustling nearby. I called for my team to hold it, then took a knee and looked towards the bushes where I heard the noise. I saw what looked to be a person standing there. That's it, just standing. I figured it was the opposing force, so I fired. Everything froze, and I could see what could only be described as a person dragging back from hell. They were beaten up and mangled looking, with these pale white eyes. When I tried to take a closer look, it went black again. The captain glared at me for a little bit for exposing our position. He didn't see whatever it was and thought that it was for no reason. We continued down the trail and hit this ambush, winning the fight. We gathered up and cleared our weapons, then began our trek back to camp. When we reached the cornfield again, I glanced around the group. We'd be gone out with 6, and I counted 7, including myself in both times. Strange, but maybe I miscounted before. After all, it was dark and I was pretty tired. When we reached the camp, I counted again, 6, including me. Something wasn't right. I asked about the other guy that was with us, and I got a funny look as a response, so I ignored it and went to sleep. The rest of the evening was uneventful. I looked into this recently, and I want to say it was a skinwalker, but it doesn't fit. The things didn't do us harm. It also changed what it looked like several times, if it was the same thing. Either way, I haven't gone out at night for a long time. When I was 10 to 12 years old, I lived with my mother. We were below poverty level poor. We lived up in the mountains around Santa Cruz, California. My mother had a friend that owned a large bit of property up there and let us stay in a trailer up there. Our trailer was very small and was right beside a garden. A chain link fence ran around the garden to keep the dog the owner had out, along with other animals. Deer and other things were very common in this area. Also inside the fence was a single room. It was built like a tiny house, but it only had one single room on the inside. This room had electricity, and since our actual trailer didn't, I spent a lot of time out there. I was super into video games. There was one thing that you should know about this. This small fenced area was only a small part of the property, but most of it was heavily forested. Also, I refused to leave the fence area because the owner's dog had been mistreated by children in the past and was very sketchy towards me at all times. If I was ever alone, it would bite at me, even through the fence. The fence was very tall and it was at least 7 feet high. The fence wasn't movable, so as long as I kept the gate closed, I was safe. That said, about the tiny bit of property, there was no one else around for miles. My mom's van is parked out in front of the gate to the fenced-in area, and a single unpaved road runs from this garden for about a mile to the main house. Every now and then I would bring friends up and they'd stay the night with me. We all thought it was pretty cool, like camping out, sort of. Besides, we would get our own room to stay in and play video games all night. It was like a dream come true, really. The downside was simple. When it got dark out, it really got dark. No city around, and the trailer would not be lit up. There would be no bathroom to use in the room, and you would have to go walk out in the dark garden in order to get to the trailer to use it. Odd things would happen out here from time to time. It was always something that could be easily explained away. Noises like people working at night sometimes, or once me and my friend were sitting out in the garden and we saw a shadow as big as a small bear bound up a tree. But the tree didn't shake like there was any weight on it. The dog also creeped me out, but angry dog, I was a kid. It happens. Now, I am a scaredy cat. I've always been. To be honest, I don't know why I even come here to tell you this scary story. I have trouble walking through a lit house if I'm even alone. My friends, however, tend to be more outgoing. Just kind of those people to get along with, I suppose. This time I had a friend over. His name was Jacob. We were staying up all night and playing Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on my Sega Genesis on a ratty old television. We started to play as the sun went down, and by the time we were finished with the game, it was about 2 a.m. That's when we heard it. We turned off the game, getting ready to find something else to play. There was a rumbling in the woods behind the room we were in, like someone was rolling something very heavy around. We hadn't heard it before because of the noises from what we were playing was too loud. Immediately I had goosebumps. Jacob was not really worried about it, but it's not like he was scared all the time or anything. The backyard was forest for miles, and it sounded like someone was constructing something, dragging something very heavy and very big. Eventually, Jacob convinced me to play some more games. I agreed on the condition that we would turn the volume down pretty low so we could hear if something was happening outside. We started playing and I didn't even notice the noise because I was so engrossed. A couple of hours later, Jacob said he had to use the bathroom. I was feeling fine by then, so I was fine when he left to the trailer to relieve himself. He was taking a while, so eventually I decided I was going to go check on him. Besides, I could use the bathroom and grab a snack while I was at it. I opened the door to leave, and he was just standing at the doorway, right outside the door. It scared the crap out of me. I asked him what he was doing and he just stood there, blocking the exit. I realized he must have sneaked up on the door because I could hear him walk away from the room, but I hadn't heard him walk back to the room. It was super quiet out. There were no noises from the city. He refused to say anything or respond. He just stood there. I told him that he was really creeping me out. But it was not unlike him to try to do this to scare me. Finally, I decided just to go to the trailer and use the bathroom myself, partially because I knew that my mother would be sleeping in there. I told him what I was doing, then moved past him. When I pushed him out of the way a little, I felt his skin, and it was freezing. I jumped a little, but it was a cold night and it had been standing there for like 30 minutes, I figured, so I figured that this was to be expected. I walked as quickly as I could over to the trailer. He followed me, like right on my tail. It was unnerving. I joked a little, saying that he had already surprised me by scaring me at the door and that the joke was already over. Finally, I got to the trailer and walked in. He didn't follow, he just stayed at the door. I checked on my mom, who was fast asleep, then turned to go to the bathroom. Now, it being a porta potty, we kept the bathroom door shut because, well, it smelled pretty bad. When I reached for the door and to try to open it, it was locked. A nervous voice came from behind the door. I'm in here." I quickly turned to look at Jacob. The door was still open, and there was nothing there, but the pitch black night. I froze in terror. I would have heard the bathroom door open if he had come in behind me and gone that way. There was no way to do it quietly. It creaked like no other. I yelped so loud that my mother woke up startled. I stared at the doorway, unable to bring myself to move a muscle. She got up and walked over there and looked out the door. Not seeing anything, she closed it and asked me what was going on. By now, Jacob was coming out of the bathroom and acting perfectly normal, but a bit confused. I explained what had happened, and Jacob said that he was just taking a long time in the bathroom. Neither of them believe me at all, no matter how much I insist. My mom is sure that I just got sleepy and imagined it. Jacob just thought I was trying to prank him. So my mom gets out this big flashlight and walks us back to the room. She tells us to go to sleep, then leaves and goes back to bed herself. Now this room doesn't have any windows or anything, so after a while I calm back down a little. I'm telling myself that my mom was right, that I must have been pretty tired and just imagined it. Jacob insists that he was in the bathroom the whole time. I'm inclined to believe him because there's just no way to really get around without being heard. So I settle down. I'm a little bit rattled, but I'm thinking I can just sleep it off through the night. Suddenly, the dog starts going nuts right beside us. The room is right against the fence, so the dog must have been right outside. I jumped so high I was surprised I didn't hit the roof. Jacob starts laughing at me, saying that I'm losing it because the dog is barking at a squirrel. It keeps going on like that for a long time. Suddenly, the barking stops and gets replaced by whimpering. We hear the dog run away. There's about 45 seconds of silence before we hear something new. A small scratching sound at the back wall of the room. We both try to be as silent as we can. Eventually, it stops. After 5 or so minutes of silence, Jacob decides to be brave. He insists he's going to go get my mother up, tell her that something crazy is going on outside and that we're gonna go from there. With some kind of divine adult protection, no doubt. I wished that he would not believe me, but there's no way I was going out there. Never. He arms himself the best he can with a tennis racket that we had in the room. He then takes a couple of deep breaths and opens the door and dashes out. I close it as quickly as I can behind him. In less than 30 seconds, I hear a scream. Not long after, the door flies open and he comes back in looking pale as a ghost. He's breathing like he just ran a marathon. His eyes look as big as dinner plates. I ask what is going on like 4 times before he finally starts getting words out. He tells me that when he walked out there and as he's walking through the garden as quickly as he could, he saw my mother just standing there. He tried to talk to her, but she stared at him with a blank expression. Getting super creeped out because of what happened to me earlier, he took a couple more steps towards her, telling her that he thought someone was out in the woods. Suddenly, her face turns to an awkward smile. Then he realizes something terrible. He hadn't noticed it sooner because of the darkness and how much of a hurry he was in. She was on the other side of the fence. Now, the door to this room does not lock, and as I explained earlier, this room had no windows. He had been trying to move stuff in front of the door as he told his story, and by the end, I was helping him. In retrospect, whatever it was harassing us seemed to be adverse to actually entering the room or the trailer, because the first flesh gate did not come in either time. He totally could have. This room was not sturdy at all. Either way, we stacked everything we could against the door, thinking somehow that, like in cartoons, that this totally would keep out a creature. For the rest of the night, we heard scratches coming from all around the room. I cried. Jacob looked like he might have left his body with fear. At one time, I thought I heard it speak too. I heard it right next to me where I was resting, against the wall. It was in my mother's voice, and it was pretty quiet. The creature used the exact phrasing and intonations she had used earlier in the night. "What's wrong?" followed immediately by, "Go to sleep." The sun must have come up eventually. The scratching eventually stopped. We heard my mom come to get us. This time it was actually her. We absolutely refused to leave the room. When we finally left the room, I bursted into tears again. We had never experienced anything like this, and we eventually moved away, but that night still haunts me. I still refuse to go out at night unless I'm with a bunch of people, and I will never ever live in the woods again. My good friend moved in next door about 6 years ago. He's married and has 3 kids. I have 2. Our families get along very well and we go on trips quite often. Sometimes we like to go camping out into the woods. That is the setting for this Skinwalker story. My friend's wife picked the location. She's part Navajo and thought it would be fun to go camping on the reservation. Unfortunately, that is exactly what we did. The area that she procured for us was pretty nice. It had a nice little flat area where we could put our tents up, but it was also surrounded by trees. This was nice because it felt like we had a sense of privacy within the trees. We were going to be there for 3 days, so we set up camp and had a good time. During the setup of camp, however, we let the kids run around, and as long as they stayed within earshot, we didn't mind where they went. While putting the finishing touches on the rainfly for my tent, one of my kids returns back to campsite with bones. Thankfully, these were obviously not human bones, but that of a large animal, probably a cow or a horse. I told the kids that this is really gross and they shouldn't be playing with dead animal parts. They reluctantly agreed and went back to playing out in the woods while we finished putting the final touches on the campsite. We got a fire going and started cooking up dinner. The sun was beginning to set, but because of the trees nearby, it was already pretty dark where we were. About halfway through dinner, I began to feel this very weird sensation coming from the woods. I had this feeling that I needed to go to the woods, but I obviously didn't want to go. Something was telling me subconsciously that I needed to go in the woods, and by myself. It was almost hypnotizing in a way. For some reason, my attention was drawn to a particular spot in the forest. I stood up and shined my flashlight in that direction. Obviously, nothing was there other than dense brush. This did catch everyone's attention, and they asked me what I was doing. I played it off how I saw a raccoon in the forest and wanted to see it better. Everyone thought this was amusing, except for my friend's wife, who was part Navajo. I could tell the way she looked at me, she knew I wasn't telling the truth. We then soon later finished our dinner and put more logs on the fire, since we were now immersed fully in the darkness of the night. I then began to develop a sense of unease coming from the forest. I felt as if there was a predator nearby, and my survival instincts tried to kick in, but my logical mind told me that I was just being paranoid and I had no true reason to feel unsafe. I was with people I knew and loved, and my friend and I did bring means to protect ourselves from animals or anything else for that matter. I had my shotgun and my friend had his pistol that he normally carries with him. I had no true reason to feel unsafe, and yet, here I was. The group decides to tell ghost stories around the campfire, as we usually do on our camping trips. This is normally one of my favorite parts of the campout, but due to how I was feeling, I was already on edge and didn't really want to do this at this time. But I didn't want to ruin everyone's fun, so I kept quiet. During the stories, rather than listening to them, I tried to listen to the sounds of the forest all around us. The normal sounds of the wildlife at night was replaced by dead silence. This is never a good sign. About halfway through my friend's favorite ghost story, we all heard what sounded like a scream. This scream sounded like it came from pretty deep in the woods, but it was too close for comfort. I stood up with my flashlight in hand and recommended that me and my friend go investigate what that sound was. My wife was the first one to shoot down that idea. Yeah, right, and leave us all here by ourselves? Yeah, that was pretty stupid, I admitted. My wife's friend then told us about the forest nearby and how sometimes they could be haunted with spirits of the forest or even inhabited by skinwalkers. At this time, all the kids seemed to be on the verge of tears, so we recommended to do something more lighthearted. My friend grabbed his guitar from his truck and began to play songs. My friend was very average at playing the guitar, yet he thought he was the best. But this did help us switch from a scary situation to a more lighthearted one. And soon enough, we had all forgotten about the scream coming from the forest. We called it a night and everyone went to their tents to go to bed. Me and my friend stayed up and made sure that the fire went out. After 30 minutes of talking, the fire was now coals and the visibility was very low. I had that hypnotizing feeling coming again from the woods. Instead of seeing the dark empty forest, I was then greeted by the hideous sight of what looked like a horse. My unease was replaced by confusion. What was a horse doing in the middle of the woods? I got up to get a closer look, and the horse slowly receded back into the woods. Luckily, I had my flashlight on me, and I shined it on the animal. This horse was not normal. It looked very ill, and its limbs were almost bent at weird angles. It wasn't until I was practically in the woods until I got a good view of it. Not only did this horse appear to be ill, it almost looked like it was deceased in a way. Parts of flesh and bone were sticking out of parts of the animal that should not have been possible. My initial thought was maybe that this horse was a victim of a bear attack, or even a cougar. I turned back and went back to camp, and I told my friend what I had seen. He was very uneasy by what I just told him. He then gave me the weirdest advice. He told me to not think about it, not even to talk about it ever again, or at least still while we were out in the woods. I agreed and we went to bed. I was then awakened by my friend and his wife at 7 a.m. We were told that we were no longer allowed to stay on the land and that we were not welcomed by the natives. I was frustrated and a little bit annoyed since my friend's wife was responsible for procuring the campsite for us to camp on. I got up and woke up my wife and my kids and told them to pack up and that we were cutting our camp trip short. They were just as annoyed as I was, but as soon as we stepped out of our tent, our frustration was replaced by fear. What littered our campsite is what appeared to be bits and pieces of animals. Most of the pieces were on the ground, while other pieces were hung up in trees, hanging off branches. The sight was pretty gruesome. It looked like a bomb had gone off, and bits and pieces of meat were everywhere. I can honestly tell you, that was the quickest my family has ever packed up our campsite. While packing up, I took a few seconds to look around, and I looked at the footprints on the ground, maybe getting an idea of who had done this. The only thing that I could see were hoof prints. We were packed up and ready to leave, and we took off from the campsite. The sun wasn't even out yet, so it was still kinda dark. While driving out of our campsite, I swear, despite the low visibility, I was able to make out a figure in the woods. And it wasn't that horse. It was something tall, something malevolent, something I'm glad we didn't stick around to see. We both get home after driving the long trip back to our houses. My wife agrees to cook everyone breakfast while I decide to put everything away. We were in such a hurry of packing that most of our stuff in the back was just thrown in there and not really organized at all. I'm about 15 minutes into putting things away when I pull up parts of the tent. As I pull it out of the trunk of the car, a white piece of material falls out and lands on the floor. I look down and I realize that we had accidentally packed a bone of one of the animals that was strewn about our campsite. It was just a creepy reminder of our experience. Nothing more. Or so I thought. It takes me another 30 more minutes and everything's finally packed and put away. I go back inside and I have my breakfast, or whatever was left over from everyone else. This is the part of the story where I wish this was the end and I could say happily ever after, but unfortunately, this is where everything began. I need to describe to you our street that we live on. Like I said, my friend and I are neighbors, but he lives across the street. But the road we live on is pretty secluded and has a lot of trees on it. Anyways, my friend and I decided to take our families into town and to spend the rest of the weekend in town doing fun things. The weekend went by faster than it normally does. That's probably because we had a great time. We returned from the town after our failed camping trip. I pull into the driveway, and to my dismay, the front door to our house is off its hinges. I tell my family to wait over at my friend's house while I investigate the damage. The front door is off its hinges and in the bushes on our front yard. There are long scratch marks around the door handle and around the corners of the door. The door also has puncture marks which are pretty deep. My guess looked like it was a bear trying to enter our home. Maybe we left some food out or something and it tried to get in. The real question is the creature still in my home? After a brief search of the house with my trusty shotgun, I found nothing to conclude that the animal was still in our home. However, I did find paw marks along the house. The paw marks didn't lead to any area that contained food, including the kitchen or dining area. Instead, they led to my bedroom. Almost directly, as if it went nowhere else. As if it knew exactly where to go and what it wanted to do. I inspected my bedroom and to my horror, I found a couple of objects that were not there before. There was a small circle of bones in the center of my bedroom. What are the odds of a bear bringing in bones to my home and placing them accidentally in a circle in my room? This made some sense with my bear theory, but the other objects in my room did not. Inside the circle of bones was a bundle of twigs that were bound together by rope in the shape of a person. The bundle of twigs had feathers, and other objects attached to it that looked very strange. Next to that was a burning candle. Whatever it was, whether it was a Navajo kid playing a prank on us or an actual skinwalker, I was pretty terrified. I was about to investigate the room further when I heard a scream come from across the street. Not just one scream, but many. I run outside with my shotgun in hand and I go across the street to meet my friend and my family. Before I can even cross the street, they all come running towards me, pointing to the back of the house, telling me that it got her! It got her! Out of this moment of chaos and confusion, my friend somehow manages to scream to me that some creature grabbed his daughter and dragged her into the woods. My friend and I then go into the woods looking for the creature and his daughter. We are not even in the woods for 5 minutes when we see what looks like his daughter just standing in the middle of the woods. Her hair is disheveled and her limbs are bent at weird angles, much like the horse on our camping trip. I begin to feel very uncomfortable. My friend, being overwhelmed with emotion, runs over to what appears to be his daughter and picks her up. He then begins asking her, "Are you okay, sweetie? Are you okay? What happened?" The girl begins to give responses, but it sounds as if she had water in her lungs. It was very unusual considering we're in the middle of the woods. The child appears to be injured, but is giving no signs that she's actually hurt. As we're walking back, I start to begin to think that maybe this little girl that he's carrying isn't his daughter. We both emerge out of the woods and both families are elated that we finally found a daughter. We were only gone for about 15 minutes. But in lieu of everything that has happened, they were pretty terrified the whole time we were away. My friend finally sets down his daughter and I'm horrified at the sight of her. I was unable to get a good look at her while we were in the woods, but now that we were in good lighting, I could get a good look at her eyes. Her eyes were milky white, much like a blind person's eyes. I only note that because this girl's known for having very bright blue eyes. As the chaos is slowly settling and our families are finally getting a grip, I try to get my friend to talk with me in a lone, private area. I try to tell him, "Hey man, something's wrong with your daughter. She doesn't look like herself." We talk for a few minutes, kind of heatedly, and we finally conclude that we will take her into the hospital in the morning. Just with everything that's been going on lately, both families felt like they needed a rest. Anyways, I am finally able to go back to my home and clean up the mess and finally bring my family over. I put a tarp over the doorway so we'll have something covering the front end of our house. I don't tell my family what I saw in the house earlier, and I don't tell them what I think what's going on with the daughter. This is something I felt maybe I should have done differently. My family and I finally turn in for the night, and we go to bed. We're pretty exhausted, so sleep comes pretty easily for us. My family and I get much needed sleep. I sleep in until about 10, and then I wake up and make my way over to my friend's house. I knock on his door. No answer. I call and text his phone. Also no answer. That's pretty strange. Maybe they're at the hospital already and we're pretty busy. I spend the rest of the day just doing other things and not thinking about what had happened this last weekend. Sure enough, time passes and 2 days go by without my friend getting in contact with me. This is very unusual considering he and I and our families are very close. Now I thought about it, I actually haven't seen him or his family since he brought home that little girl that looked like his daughter. I told myself if I didn't see them in 3 days, I'd call the police. Just before that time, however, sure enough, my friend emerges from his home. Except something's different. Something's wrong. My friend's head is kind of at a weird angle. His neck looks bent and his limbs are kind of contorted in different directions. His eyes are milky white. He tells me that I should come over and bring the whole family over. We'll have a great time. He doesn't sound like himself. He sounds like he's speaking out of an old, staticky radio. I tell him, sure thing, let me just go grab my family, and I head back inside. During this time, I decide to call the police and report a missing persons. That thing was not my friend. It was something that is imitating him. Sure enough, the police come about 2 hours later and I fill out a report. During that time, the police decide to take the liberty to go investigate the house of my friend. While the police are investigating, more police cars show up, as well as a fire truck and an ambulance.
The police didn't disclose any information until about 2 weeks later, where I found out that my friend's family had disappeared. They told me that the case was still ongoing since they didn't find any bodies, but they have found enough pieces to conclude that they're most likely dead. The official police reports say that my friend and his family were dragged off by a bear of some kind and eaten out in the woods, but something tells me, deep down, that
A couple of years ago, I was in the Boy Scouts. We would go camping over the summer up in the mountains called Camp Thunder Campgrounds. This was my second year there, and had tons of fun the year before. Part of the fun for me and my friends were the pranks with other scout tribes. The year before, we got pranked pretty well. Someone put a dead possum in my sleeping bag. Needless to say, I was ready to get my revenge. This year I brought a gorilla mask along with some shaving cream. The gorilla mask was to conceal my identity, but if I could get a scare out of someone, then that would also be a bonus. The scout camp was up in the mountains, and naturally, we had to keep our eyes open for bears. There had been a scare a few years back when a bear found its way inside of a campsite when some scouts left out some Slim Jims, but nothing too life-threatening. We heard the story every year to help prevent unsafe camping techniques, and also to add an additional precaution to not go out past curfew. Curfew was a big deal. If you were caught out past curfew, you and your tribe could be asked to leave, so stealth was a big factor I intended on keeping. I wanted to wait until the last night to do any pranks, so if I did get caught, then I would only be sent home on the last day. The week was fun, and every day we were warned about not going out at night. The leaders of the camp had a camp bell that they would ring every morning at the meeting station. They also said that we could ring it if anyone saw a bear to warn the other campers. During the week, we had a visit from the park rangers. They told us that the town nearby has had bears coming into their yards and trying to get into their trash. The camp leaders told us that if anyone wanted to leave, due to safety of the bears, that the camp would offer us a free refund for anyone that left. Needless to say, no one left. The second to last morning, I woke up to a dozen frogs in my cabin. Someone had pranked me. Tonight, I was definitely going to get my revenge, and then some. The whole day went on slower than normal, but night finally came. I got ready and set out late, wearing my gorilla mask and putting the shaving cream in my backpack. I wanted to make sure I got whoever was getting me and my tribe, so I decided to hit all the tribes. I made my way to the first camp. They were all fast asleep. I entered the campgrounds and put shaving cream all over their cabins. For good measure, I made sure to bang on the windows and to let them see my mask to scare them. I banged on the windows, and sure enough, the scouts were pissing themselves. I tried to contain my laughter as I took off to the other camps. As I was in between camps, I got a weird feeling, like I was being watched. I was out in the woods all by myself, in a bear-infested woods, but I tried not to think about it. By this time, word had gotten around that someone was pranking the campsites, so the adults were out looking with flashlights. I decided that one prank was enough, and I started heading back to my camp, across the campgrounds. As I was walking, I heard a faint ring of a bell. The bear bell. Oh great. Either someone thought I was the bear, or there was an actual bear lurking around the campgrounds. I began to pick up the pace when I heard something behind me, snapping twigs and breathing. I did have a flashlight, but something told me not to look behind me. I began to hear a low growl, and surprisingly, words. Something was calling my name. What kind of animal could growl and also speak like a person? Normally with bears, you're supposed to walk away slowly, but for whatever reason, I disregarded this advice and I took off for my campsite. As I was running, I heard screaming from behind me and thrashing around. I felt something grab my bag, and I left it behind. Whatever it was seemed content with the bag, and it stopped following me, but I continued running. I made it back to the campgrounds, and no one saw me come in. Someone did stop by our campgrounds a couple of minutes later and told us to do a head count.
They told us that 2 scouts were missing from the campgrounds, and they told us to stay inside the cabin. The next day we found out that the 2 campers that went missing were eaten by something. Everyone said they were bears, but me personally, I think it was something else. I can't but help think how lucky I was to not be among those that were grabbed. What was it that took those campers in the middle of the night? Was it the same creature that was behind me? How did it know how to speak? And how did it know my name? We owned property up in northern Idaho, where my family would naturally farm potatoes. Yes, I know, cliche. We owned a couple 100 acres with little to no people nearby. Growing up, I've only seen 3 people drive by our farm. One was our neighbor looking for his lost horse. The other 2 were college kids that had gotten lost on their way to Canada. With our large farm being so large, we had random sets of barns to house fuel and other machinery around the farm. In all, we had about 5 barns or so around the farm, and we were always told to keep the barns closed. I somewhat laughed at this idea. Nothing was out here but random deer and coyotes. I remember one summer, my sister left the barn door open and we had issues with raccoons for the rest of the year. I was the second oldest, and I was responsible for harvesting crops and storing them in the barn, while my father would go to the barns and collect the harvest for the year. Like I said, I was the second oldest. My older brother Trevor died when he was young in a tragic accident with one of the tractors. I was only 10 at the time. He was 17. I remember my father coming in late one night, covered in blood, crying with my mother. Apparently, my brother left the tractor in neutral and the tractor rolled on top of him, crushing him. My father went out to look for him when he didn't show for dinner. My father was never the same after that night, and neither was my family. Instead of being able to drive at 14 like my older brother, I had to wait till I was 18 until I was able to drive one of the tractors. This was only because my father was running low on help, and I had to talk him into it for 4 years. When I would harvest, I would like to either go in the mornings or late at night when the air was cool, since our tractors were old and did not have AC. My father would stay up late until I would come in from the late nights of harvesting crops. He would never go to bed until I would come in. During those nights of harvesting, I would see some interesting sights, some of which were haunting. I remember once I accidentally ran over a small deer that was laying in the tall crops. This was quite gruesome and caught me off guard. Blood went everywhere and I had to clean the tractor for 30 minutes. I remember one night I saw the remains of what looked like a calf that was eaten by wolves on my way back from walking inside from the harvest. Normally something like this doesn't faze me, but coming in at 2 in the morning after a harvest, it was a bit spooky. The barn nearest the house was a brisk 15-minute walk, which I normally walked without a flashlight, only having the moon to guide me. But none of that compares to what I saw one evening. Something happened one night, something I never did tell my dad, but I think I saw something imitate my dead brother. Not like another person, but a creature. Something intelligent, but evil. So here is what happened. Like I said before, we were told to always keep the barn doors closed on the property. Well, I began to get lazy the later my harvest got and the closer the barn was to the house, the more likely I figured that no one or no thing was too deadly that would try to stay in the barn that we couldn't remove on our own. It wasn't that big of a deal, but keeping the barn door open would save me from having to hop out of the tractor and opening the somewhat heavy barn door again. It would literally save me less than 1 minute of time, but coming in late after spending hours of harvesting late at night would make a big difference in my teenage mind. The day started like any other, and school dragged on like it normally did. I was driving home from school, not really paying attention to the road, when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. As I slowed down, I noticed a large, hairy animal dart quickly across the road. It looked like a wolf, but it was standing up on 2 legs. It ran as if it was wounded, but it moved so fast, impossibly fast. As quickly as the creature entered my view,
It left, only leaving a small trail of dust in its path. The direction the creature was running, it would reach my family's farm in the next 3 miles, but the likelihood the thing continued straight was really unlikely. The rest of the drive home, I was freaked out, mainly because I almost crashed my car, but I've never seen anything that big, that fast, in this area. I remember one summer I went and visited my uncle in Alaska, and we went and hunted moose. Kinda reminded me of that, but the speed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I arrived home, and the creature seemed to have escaped my mind when I saw my mother had cooked my favorite pie. After some homework, 2 slices of pie, a tall glass of milk, and some Jets vs. Patriots on ESPN, I was ready to get my chores done on the farm. I got old Betsy, aka the green tractor, fired up and began my route to harvest the potatoes, leaving the barn door open. The tractor was equipped with these old headlights that I would use to see about 30 feet ahead of me or so. For the most part, they were terrible, but considering there was nothing here for me to hit in these fields, I was in good hands. I was halfway through my route when I began to smell this terrible smell. It smelled much like that deer I hit with the tractor, but much worse. It had a weird metallic smell, like a burnt metal. For a moment I thought old Betsy needed a new belt, but we replaced it last year. The belts usually last for 5 years easy. I made sure to keep my eyes open as I continued driving in the endless fields that laid ahead of me. I was hoping that I wouldn't have a breakdown in the middle of the field. If that were to happen, it would take me an hour or so to get back. Thankfully, the tractor didn't break down, and I continued my route. I was working my way back when the tractor lights briefly scanned across the open field, and I saw something large moving quickly, just barely out of the view of the lights. It was headed to the barn that I foolishly left open. My mind raced back to earlier in that day when I saw the creature. The creature looked like it ended up on my farm. Luckily, I was in Betsy, which was near impossible to enter while I was driving. Unfortunately, I did have to park it inside the barn I left open, and I would have to make the 15-minute walk back to the house with nothing to protect me. I hesitantly drove back to the barn after a few hours of collecting potatoes. The smell of the burnt metal was incredibly strong, and I began to feel this intense evil feeling in the air. I opened the barn door, which I left ajar, and quickly entered the tractor to pull it in. The lights on the tractor illuminated the barn. Our barns were a mess and had old tools and parts laying around. It wouldn't be that difficult to hide if you really wanted to. I made sure to double check the barn, although inside the tractor to make sure nothing got in while I was away. After waiting for 5 minutes or so, I turned off the key to the tractor, which in turn turned off my light source from inside the barn. Thankfully, the moon was out and it was able to cast some light inside the old barn. I exited the tractor and made sure to refuel the tractor before I left. As I was returning the empty fuel can, I heard my name, although it was completely distorted. It sounded like someone was speaking with damaged lungs and a really raspy voice, like they'd been smoking for 50 or so years. My first thought was that a hobo had entered the barn or something, but then I remembered the voice was calling my name. How did it know my name? I then thought that my father was out in the barn, trying to scare me. It wouldn't be the first time my father gave me a good scare, but it was very late, and for someone to pull this prank like this, you'd have to be pretty dedicated. I was able to catch a small glimpse of something that looked tall and hairy in the corner of the barn. I immediately turned tail and ran towards my home. This was a ridiculous endeavor. I was in no shape to be outrunning anything, let alone what I saw earlier that was running at those speeds. I heard what sounded like a large animal thrashing around the barn, and then hot on my trail. I was halfway back to my house when I heard something that sounded like my dead brother, calling me by my nickname that no one ever called me but him. I stupidly turned around to see the outline of my brother, but he looked like he had been hit by a car. His neck and limbs were all bent and pieces of flesh were hanging off of him. It was hard to tell what exactly I was looking at, since I felt like I was going to die from all the running and the thought of a large creature trying to kill me. I knew whatever it was trying to pretend to be my brother must have had something to do with his death. How did it know what he looked like?
How did he know my nickname? Only my brother called me. I continued running and made it back to the house. The entire time, I could hear breathing behind me. I made the 15-minute walk into a 5-minute run. Because of this, I no longer harvest late at night, and I now have questions about the creature and about how it knew so much about my brother. Regardless, I felt lucky that I was alive, and I no longer leave the barn door open.
I am not one for camping. I simply just do not see the appeal. However, my daughter insisted that we go camping together, and I would do anything to spend more time with my daughter. So naturally, we went camping, but in our backyard. Our backyard is pretty nice. It's fenced in and has a fire pit. However, on the other side of the fence is an endless forest of trees. Some nights we hear animals out in the woods, nothing outside the ordinary. We set up camp inside our fence. We did this mainly so we could plug in a TV and watch TV while camping. Not exactly traditional camping, but it worked for me. Things started off great. We pitched the tent, inflated the air mattress, and started a fire out in our fire pit. This was actually kinda nice. This kind of camping was much different than the kind I had with my family growing up. We put out the fire early and went inside our tent to watch some TV. My daughter, being young, naturally wanted to watch Frozen. I sighed in frustration and agreed. It wasn't long into the movie before I was fast asleep. I assume it wasn't much longer before my daughter did the same. I woke up a couple hours later. My daughter was fast asleep inside her sleeping bag. The TV was still on. I was about to turn off the TV and go inside to use the bathroom, which is a huge perk camping in your backyard. But I was stopped by the sound of what sounded like an elk screeching out in the woods, just on the other side of the fence. I thought. That sounded kinda close, and kind of odd. I didn't think elk were nocturnal animals. I could be wrong. I was about to get up again when I heard the weird sound of something tampering with the fence. It sounded like the elk was rubbing against the fence, or trying to jump over. I know elk will sometimes rub their antlers on trees, but not normally a fence. I was kind of paralyzed by this. The brief thought of a burglar jumping in our backyard terrified me. At that moment, I was able to hear something successfully jumping over our fence. Now, I was on full alert. I could hear the sounds of something walking around our backyard. It sounded like it was walking on all fours, but I could be wrong. This would, however, support my elk theory. The animal then walked over to our tent. I was able to tell due to the footsteps, and I was able to hear heavy breathing. The breathing was not natural. It sounded as if someone was trying to breathe, but their lungs were filled with blood. The creature then started to circle our tent. I could see parts of the tent caving in, as if someone was pushing their hand against the canvas. This was terrifying. It definitely looked like a hand. Thankfully, my daughter was in the middle of the tent, and whoever was outside was not able to touch her. The creature then walked around to the front of the tent, and seemed to stumble across the extension cord coming from the TV. It began pulling on the cord, and the TV began to move. This snapped me out of my shock, and I immediately got up and unplugged the TV. The cord was quickly pulled out of the tent. I went over and hugged my daughter, doing my best to control my breathing. My heart was pounding outside of my chest. A part of me was glad that my daughter was still asleep. The creature then made its way closer to the front of the tent. That is when I began to see the zipper to the tent move. It was trying to get in. Again, I was able to hear the creature breathing so unnaturally. I did the only thing that I thought I could do at the time, and I just held the zipper closed. The creature eventually stopped and continued walking around the backyard. At one point, it sounded like the creature was on our deck. The creature definitely had hooves. It wasn't long before our automatic porch light turned on, casting a shadow of the creature on our tent. The outline was terrifying. Whatever it was tall, it was lanky. The limbs looked bent. A part of me wanted to open the tent and peer outside to see whatever creature this was, but something told me that was a stupid idea. Thankfully, the porch light seemed to spook the creature off and it ran off in the backyard, jumping over our fence. I took this time to pick up my daughter and head inside. I moved quicker than normal and thankfully, my daughter didn't wake. I was able to open the door quickly and lock it behind me while holding my daughter. I set her down in her room on her bed, and we both spent the night inside. The next morning, I woke up and went outside to clean up camp. I could see hoof prints around my backyard. The prints were circling our tent and all over the backyard. They definitely belonged to a deer of some kind. Keep in mind, my backyard fence is about 6 feet tall. Not an easy jump for anyone. I just brushed it off as a weird encounter with a deer in my backyard. I was kind of impressed for the deer to be able to jump like that. Anyways, fast forward a week. I'm out by the fire pit, enjoying a nice beer. The fire pit is not too far from the fence. As I'm relaxing by the fire, I'm able to hear something on the other side of the fence. It's that breathing again. That disturbing breathing. I immediately hop up and try to look over the fence. By the time I get there, I'm only able to see something running off into the woods. It looked big. I then decide that I am done being outside, so I go put out the fire and head back in. I'm freaked out about everything, but I don't tell my wife. She gets spooked about everything. I spent the rest of the evening just hanging out and watching TV downstairs. I can hear my wife doing the dishes in the kitchen. She enjoys doing it and it helps her relax for some reason. Lucky me. Like most kitchen sinks, there's a window nearby that allows a full view of the backyard. As I'm relaxing and watching TV, I hear the shattering of dishes, followed by my wife saying, "What the hell is that?" She's pointing out the window to the backyard. I get up and glance to see what she's looking at and follow her finger. Standing in the backyard is only what I can describe as a demon. The creature was tall and pale, very long limbs. It had antlers but had the face of a man. The creature seemed unaware that we were able to see him. It seemed to be sniffing around where I was sitting near the campfire. I did the only thing I thought I could do at the time and called the police. Before I was able to finish the call, the creature had jumped back over the fence and off into the woods. I made a report over the phone, but I did not recommend any officers coming out. The creature had left, so there was no point. After dealing with that and trying to calm down my wife, it was pretty late at night. I'm not sure what to call it. The only thing that comes to my mind is a demon of the forest. I'm pretty sure the creature that my wife and I saw was the same creature that was trying to get into the tent that one night. Whatever the creature was, it was now getting braver. My wife and I began waking up late at night. We began hearing sounds coming from our backyard. They were the sounds of that same scream with the lungs filled with blood. This creature was smart. It stood just far enough to where it would not turn on our automatic porch light. Standing in the darkness of our backyard, at times I would see what looked like red eyes peering back at me, but I can't be completely sure. We would waken to screams about every other night, each time the screams being closer and closer. I think one night the creature was able to enter our home. I remember waking from a deep slumber, still very groggy and disoriented. My daughter leaves the bathroom light on, which is down the hall from our bedroom. Its dull light shines through the bottom of our doorway. Once I was awakened, I heard the sounds of what sounded like hooves coming up our wooden stairs. The footsteps went from the stairs to the front of my bedroom door. I could see the shadow underneath the door. I could hear the door handle slowly turning, but the door never opened. The creature then turned around and walked back down the stairs. For whatever reason, instead of getting up and making sure my house was cleared of whatever creature, I just went back to bed. I woke up the next morning and immediately checked on my daughter. She was okay. Whatever I had experienced the night before must have been a dream. That is until I went downstairs and saw the back door. It was wide open. I am a forest ranger, and I cover one of the largest national parks in the United States. I cannot give you my station's name for obvious reasons. Quick backstory. I was recruited out of college by one of my professors who retired from the parks and worked part-time as an econ teacher at my college. He was a great man, but passed away a few years ago to cancer, unfortunately. I have been working at this location for about 4 years, but overall 9 years in other locations. Like I said, I have been here for 4 years, but I still see and hear things that surprise me every day. For starters, this place is odd. It's unlike any forest I've ever encountered in my career. The forest has a perpetual, yet almost paranormal, thick fog. Once you leave the forest grounds, the sky clears for the most part. It's like an invisible boundary. This fog makes it very difficult to navigate, and if you are new to the area, you are bound to get lost. It's very strange. Another thing that is strange is instead of using standard weapons, we carry a heavy arsenal in our station. These aren't your typical rifles, but rather military-grade fully automatic weapons. I have never seen this ever at any Forest Service station. I am told that the head ranger was good friends with a guy in the army, and because of that, we got the hookup. Another excuse I've heard for these kind of weapons is that there is a lot of poaching in the forest. We have a lot of endangered animals in the forest and we need to protect them. But I don't know. Other forests I was stationed at, we typically just enforce this with heavy fines. But every place is different. Another thing that is very strange is that there is a highway-like road that goes through the part of the forest but doesn't exit, meaning that it leads somewhere in the forest. Now here's the weird part. Only people with military authorization are allowed to use this road. Forest rangers and other personnel are not allowed to use the road or even walk adjacent to it to see where it leads. Even talking about the road will lead you to being reassigned or terminated. Another thing that's weird about this forest is that there is a third-party company that is in charge of taking care of any missing persons case inside the forest. This company doesn't even have a name, not even a logo that's associated with. We just call them on a special telephone that we have in our chief ranger's office. Needless to say, we're kept pretty busy throughout the year, helping campers find their campsites, catching illegal fishermen and hunters, you know, the usual. The strangest and somewhat terrifying thing about all of this is that no ranger is allowed out of the forest past 8 a.m. or before 6 a.m. I have no explanation why this rule is in place, but it makes me and other rangers uneasy. It's as if something's out there and we need to protect ourselves during the night. Now that I've covered the backstory, let me tell you about my terrifying experience. It was Tuesday, around 6:30 a.m. The sun had yet to rise and the visibility was near non-existent. I was on a back trail with my four-wheeler, driving slowly not to wake any nearby campers that were sleeping. I have my four-wheeler lights on, plus a heavy-duty headlight I like to wear when I'm driving. This helps me see through the thick fog. Mornings are typically quiet, due to the sun not being able to reach through the forest fog until about 8 a.m. But this morning was deathly quiet. There were no noises being made by any animals of any kind. No birds chirping, bugs buzzing. I didn't pay much attention to this since the low hum of the four-wheeler drowned out the silence. The lights on my four-wheeler then came across a campsite that instantly disturbed me. The campsite looked like a crime scene. The tent was shredded and blood covered the tent. The campsite was utterly destroyed. It looked like a bear had dragged someone across the campsite while bleeding everywhere. I didn't find any bodies. Other than the blood, there were no remnants of anyone. Technically, this event would be considered a missing persons case, and the third-party company would investigate. I was about to call it in, but I was perplexed by the situation. I had never seen so much blood before. I couldn't help but think that whatever creature did this was still here. That's when I noticed how quiet it was outside. I felt exposed. I went back to my four-wheeler and tore off in the direction of the main station, not caring about waking any of the other campers. I reached back in record time and called in the situation to the third-party company. They came quickly and immediately quarantined the campsite and any nearby campsites. They were in hazmat suits. Some of them were holding machine guns and making sure that no one could see what was going on. I was interviewed and told that what had happened was a pack of wolves had gotten hold of some campers that left out some food. This was interesting. I had worked here for 4 years and never seen or heard any wolves before. I had seen mountain lions and bears, but never wolves. By the time the interview had ended, it was 8:17 a.m. and the campsite was cleaned up. The other rangers were coming in from checking their respective sectors and asked me what had happened. I told them I couldn't say and not to worry about it. They seemed spooked since they could tell I was still recovering from seeing that horrific sight only hours before. This had been the first time I'd stumbled across anything like this in this forest. Apparently the third-party company didn't seem fazed and it looked like business as usual for them. As I said before, the company was unnamed and didn't have any logos, so I couldn't tell you what the name of the company was. We would see them roughly once a week or so, investigating or cleaning up campsites. Again, this was unique to this forest and this forest alone. At 9 a.m., we all met for a morning meeting. The chief ranger exited his office with the man that interviewed me and met us all out in the meeting area. The man that interviewed me spoke first. He didn't identify himself or who he was with, but thanked us for our cooperation and that new measures were going to be in place. The first being that curfew was now from 6 p.m. till 9 a.m. Also that no one was allowed in or out of the campgrounds. If anyone tried to leave, that they were to be escorted back to their campsites until the investigation had ended. If they refused, then we had the legal right to detain them and place them inside our holding cells. Another change was that once curfew began, that we were to take turns guarding the perimeter of the ranger station, using lethal force against, and I quote, any creatures. The man was not specific as to what kind. I think this was by design. He then thanked us for our cooperation and left. The chief ranger then spoke and reconfirmed everything the man had said earlier. He made it clear that we were not to be alone and not to be out past curfew. The rest of the day was complete chaos. Most, if not all campers, were trying to leave the campgrounds. We had to escort them back to their campsites, save a handful of them that we ended up detaining. They had been spooked by the investigation and caught wind of what had happened. They all wanted to leave. And for that, I don't blame them. I did find it odd that we had to detain people from leaving the campgrounds. I can see why we wouldn't let in new campers, but not to let them out? That seemed kind of wrong. Throughout the day, we received reports of large wolves around the campsites. I took a couple of rangers with me out to the areas where the reports were called in from. We were armed with the fully automatic weapons and began looking for the wolves in the dense woods that were covered with the fog. The fog was thick and made any visibility near impossible. We did see a couple of tracks, but they were inconsistent. They would start off as wolf prints, but then gradually change into hooves of some kind. My theory was that the hoof prints were older and harder, and it looked like the prints were changing, but were just old prints that hadn't rubbed away yet. It didn't make perfect sense, but that's what I went with. While looking for the wolves, we came across a figure standing in one of the paths. It looked like a young girl. She looked ill. Our visibility wasn't great, but it was clear that she was disoriented. Her hair was messy and had twigs in it. Her limbs looked bruised and broken. One of the junior rangers went over to assist, but she walked off the path away from us. The junior ranger followed her, assuming that she was scared of us since we had guns and that we were strangers to her. The ranger set aside his gun to comfort her and continued walking towards her. Suddenly, we heard a shriek coming from deep inside the forest, away from the girl. We all looked in the other direction, only for a moment, and looked back. The junior ranger was now nowhere in sight. "What the hell?" I said out loud. I readied it out to the ranger, but no reply. I walked over to where he was last seen and picked up his gun. I kept within the sight of the other rangers, not daring to go further. Well, he knows his way back," I said. I walked back to the path, and I took the other rangers back to the ranger station. We get back to the station, and surprisingly enough, it's 5 p.m. Where did the time go? I wondered. I hope the junior ranger makes it back before curfew. It's only an hour away. The handful of rangers went inside, and we got ready for curfew. We have rangers ready, standing on the balcony with spotlights and machine guns. Again, we aren't exactly sure what we're looking for, but were told to shoot any creature within sight. I glance at my watch every 5 minutes or so, waiting on the junior ranger to arrive until 6 p.m. rolls around. We get inside the station, and I begin to worry what will happen over the night with the campers and rangers stuck outside. During the night, I am given the shift 2 to 4 in the morning to stand guard on the ranger station. I am accompanied with a fellow ranger named Gabe. He has been at the station for roughly the same amount of time I have been. We were well acquainted, and even hung outside of work a couple of times. Needless to say that my shift was somewhat enjoyable, minus the fact that we were somewhat terrified of being outside on watch. Again, we did not know what we were looking for. Nothing happened the first hour. I worked the spotlight, and Gabe kept his aim with his weapon. We probably enjoyed ourselves too much and were distracted when we heard rustling in the woods not too far from the station. I aimed the spotlight in the woods and saw the silhouette of a very large animal. The eyes were reflecting an eerie green color that looked haunting. The animal looked like a wolf, but with the mass of a bear. We were surprisingly not too concerned since we were safe from harm being on top of the station. Gabe took aim and shot twice, once clearly hitting the animal. Nothing happened. Gabe chuckled a nervous laugh. "I did hit that thing, right?" I agreed, and Gabe fired again, but to the same effect. Finally, Gabe just let it rip and went full auto on the animal. By this time, more rangers emerged on top of the station. They were obviously trying to see what we were shooting at. Once Gabe finished the clip, the animal finally sprinted off, but to our horror, on only 2 legs. You could hear the other rangers gasp in terror at the ungodly sight of this unknown beast. By this time, all the rangers were talking and theorizing what we were looking at. After 15 minutes in the cold evening air, all the excitement died down and we were left to finish our shift with only Gabe and I. By the time we were done with our shift, the other rangers seemed worked up. Word had gone around about the creature in the woods. I tried to get as much sleep as I could before 9 a.m., but to no avail. 9 a.m. came around and the curfew was lifted. The rangers were able to start their duties in the forest, although hesitantly. Most rangers either saw or heard the events last night, and they didn't want to meet the seemingly bulletproof werewolf. I was worried about the junior ranger that went missing yesterday, and I made sure to keep my eyes peeled while servicing the forest. I gathered a group of 6 rangers, and we loaded our guns on our 4-wheelers and took off into the endless forest that surrounded us. We didn't have to drive very far to see that the creature made very easy prey of the campers that were forced to stay quarantined in the forest. The first campsite we reached had a camping trailer turned over. The campsite was destroyed. I jumped off my 4-wheeler and readied my weapon. Other rangers followed me as we investigated the campsite for anyone that was hurt or needed medical attention. This campsite had a lingering odor that I can only describe as rotting meat. It was horrific and led me to believe that whoever was staying here was definitely dead. The site was covered in blood, and the trail that led out looked like someone was being dragged. After a brief search at the campsite, we saw that no one was there. I decided that it wasn't safe for us to be out and we should return back to the station. As I was walking back to my 4-wheeler, we all heard the sound of a screaming person, but it sounded so wrong. Have you ever tried to scream underwater? That's what it kind of sounded like at first, but it was accompanied with the sound of radio static. All of our attention was drawn towards the area where the sound was coming from, and to our horror, we saw what looked like 3 figures standing off in the fog of the forest. They were all obscured by the fog, but we were able to see what looked like antlers on people. What? The screams continued. Rather than investigate to see if the people were okay, I made the decision to take everyone back to the station for safety. I hopped on my 4-wheeler and drove back with my fellow rangers, with the screams of the people fading in the forest. That is, until the screams were getting louder. We were being chased by these things, and they were gaining on us. I was going full throttle, and yet these creatures made ground. At one point, I could hear footsteps of something heavy making its way behind me. I was the second to last rider in our group, and for a brief moment, I swear I could hear something heavily breathing behind me. A part of me wanted to look, but I knew if I looked,
I would definitely die. The fear and curiosity was on the forefront of my mind, but I was too terrified to look. Finally, we were able to see what looked like the station just a couple of meters off the trail. By this time, the screams and sounds had stopped. We pulled into the station, and I was able to see that the ranger behind me was missing. The ranger either went another way, or something grabbed him out there. Something was actively picking off the rangers. Something is eating the campers in the campground. It seems that all we can do is try to survive, whatever creatures were in the forest. We call in the trashed campsite to the third-party company, and we report the missing ranger. The chief ranger now catches wind of the two missing rangers and seems spooked. The company comes in as usual and pulls in with a full hazmat team, as well as a full-suited SWAT team that are wearing gas masks. The head guy from the company calls an impromptu meeting with all the staff and rangers on the campgrounds. The meeting is brief, and hardly no information is shared about what is going on, or what the creatures were. He then tells us that we are no longer allowed outside. We were to defend the ranger station at all costs. This meant that we were not allowed to open the doors to anyone unless it was him or another high-ranking military personnel who should be there in about 3 days. Essentially, we were being quarantined inside the ranger station for 3 days, until the military is able to come and relieve us of the station. The man leaves and the chief ranger says a few words before the meeting ends. Look guys, this is not the first time something like this has happened. This is all pretty standard and we will get through this, as long as we stay together and stay outside of the fog. The people that you see in the fog are no longer people. Don't be fooled if they try to speak to you. Shoot anything that won't come inside the spotlight. They hate the light. What? What was going on? What the hell does that even mean? I thought to myself. What did he mean by, they aren't people anymore? What was the thing that was out in the woods? What is going on with the people in the campsites? Why am I not getting any answers? The rest of the day, all of the rangers are posted up inside the station. Their weapons are pointed at the reinforced barriers on the doors and windows. The company cleaning up the sites began using flamethrowers on the crime scenes inside the campgrounds. I was able to see this since I was posted on the roof again with Ranger Gabe. It was clear that whatever was making these messes, they wanted to remove any evidence of it being alive. Night came quickly, mainly because we were all dreading it, and this made time go by way faster. I was to take the late shift again from 4 to 6 a.m., but I wasn't paired with Gabe. I had Emily, who was a good ranger but was in her 40s and was thinking to transfer soon. She wasn't someone I could easily talk to, but was still a nice person. I tried my best to get them sleep before my shift, but once night came, we all heard the screams. Again, they sounded distorted and infused with static. This chilled me to the bone since there were way more of these things out there. It sounded like a dozen or so, and they were all circling the station, just out of view of the spotlight. About every hour or so, we would hear shots fired, but nothing would come of it. 4 o'clock came and I had about 2 hours of sleep. I was exhausted, but the adrenaline and the situation was keeping me awake. Emily and I perched on top of the station, and Emily worked the spotlight. The light cut through the thick darkness and fog, providing a small beam of light in the dark void of the night. I was able to make out green eyes surrounding the station, but whenever the lights would shine in that direction, the creatures would fall back behind the dense trees that surrounded the station. About 7 minutes into my shift, and I saw a figure walk out from the trees about 50 yards away from the station. I aimed my machine gun at its center mass and had my finger ready to shoot when Emily shined the light on it to reveal that it was the junior ranger that went missing the day before. "There's no way," I screamed as I aimed my gun away. The junior ranger looked like he was dragged behind a horse for 3 miles. His limbs were all broken, his neck was twisted, and his head was bent at a 90-degree angle. "Rookie," I screamed, "are you okay? What happened?" He didn't say anything. He just stood there as if he didn't hear me. Emily screamed at me, telling me to shoot him and shoot him now. "I'm not gonna shoot him, he's hurt," I responded defiantly. "It's not him anymore, shoot him." I aimed down the sights to get a better look at him. The junior ranger had his mouth open as if he was about to say something. The sound of the horrific scream came out surprisingly at a loud volume.
I was taken back by this and lost my aim for only a moment. I wasn't ready to shoot what looked like a fellow ranger. I aimed again and quickly unloaded my mag inside of him, each shot clearly hitting with bits and chunks flying off, but he just stood there. I reloaded and went to aim again when I saw he was gone. What was left behind was a small puddle of black oily substance that smelled like the spoiled meat from earlier. Screeching now began from the forest, and it got louder and louder. The creatures were a little bit more visible, but still unclear. They seemed unfazed by our firepower and were ready to make a move on our station. We called down to the rest of the station and told them that we were on high alert. Every person was armed in less than a minute, guarding an entryway of the station. We remained on top of the station, providing spotlight coverage for those below. We began to hear a mixture of screams from both the creatures and the rangers. It sounded as if the creatures were flanking on all sides and were trying to make it inside. More figures emerged from the forest, screeching while doing so. The sounds alone were enough to disorient and to terrify anyone that was nearby. The creatures were fast. It was almost as if our bullets were useless. Emily told me that all we had to do was to make it to sunrise and that we would be okay. At this rate things were going, I wasn't sure if that was possible. It sounded as if whatever those things were inside. There was still gunfire for the next 10 minutes or so. Then, there was an eerie silence that fell over the station. The rangers below had either ran out of bullets or, worse, the creatures had gotten them. Emily and I stayed on the roof, locking the only access point hatch, preventing anything from getting to us. We still had some ammo and our spotlight, but somehow the creatures were able to find a fuse box inside, and all the power to the station went out. We were stranded on top of the station in complete darkness, surrounded by shape-shifting creatures that wanted to kill us. All we could do was to remain as silent as possible, hoping that the creatures were either satisfied with the people below, or they just forgot about us up top. We could see them in the darkness, with their green glowing eyes walking around, some on all fours, others upright like a person. The screeching didn't stop until the sun came up a few hours later. We waited a few hours for good measure, before slowly descending into the horrors that laid waiting for us. Just like the other campsites from the days earlier, the station was destroyed. Blood and body parts were everywhere, but there was never a full body that we could recognize from the mess. They were either unidentifiable or they were missing. It was clear that the only people left alive in the forest was Emily and I. I went to radio in the company to tell them what had happened and called in reinforcements. They were there in record time, and with a large convoy of people in hazmat suits and machine guns. We were questioned about the event that had happened the night before.
I'm 16, and I live in the backwoods of South Carolina. I've heard stories from the local kids of creepy things that happen in the forest, about 2 miles away from my new home. I decided to go check it out because how scary can it really be? I grab a pistol and a knife, as well as a flashlight, and I head out into the dense forest. As I'm in the forest, it starts to get dark. I turn on my flashlight. A heavy fog all of a sudden rolls in, bringing in a smell of copper and burnt hair. The hairs on the back of my neck start to stand on end. I start to hear this weird sound. It sounds like whispering and giggling. I hear something running around in the woods nearby. I hear it get louder and closer. I turn around to see something crawling extremely fast and low to the ground, on all 4 legs. Whatever it was seemed to have arms and legs, like a human. I fire a shot right into its back, and I can see the blood splatter and a gunshot wound. It lets out a blood-curdling screech and retreats back into the woods. The fog lifts and the smell, suddenly, goes away. I nope my way out of there, all the way home. I get home and there it is, right in my driveway. It runs towards me and I shoot at it, but the bullets don't seem to fire. My gun was on safety. It jumps up and all I can see are its huge white eyes, and I black out. I wake up some time later on top of my dad's car, with my dad standing over me, trying to wake me up. My head hurts like nothing else, and my ears are ringing. I tell my dad what had happened in the woods, and he just laughs and tells me it was probably nothing. Life, as I know it, goes back to normal for about 3 hours, when my dad says, "Hey Jake, mind getting me some of those steaks out of the fridge?" I look at him and say, "Dad, my name's Nick, not Jake." He just looks at me like he's full of hatred. I just give him the steaks, and he just goes into his room with them, uncooked. He comes out of his room about an hour later with only the packaging and throws them away. I don't even think about asking what had happened. At 11 p.m., he tells me to go to bed, which is odd, because it's Friday and he doesn't usually care when I stay up, but I do as I'm told and I go to my room. Around 3:15 in the morning, my door opens. It's my dad. I say nothing and pretend to be asleep. The smell of copper returns to the air and I feel sick to my stomach. My dad just sits on the edge of my bed and just looks at me for what I would say to be about 30 minutes. He then mumbles something under his breath, with a voice I don't recognize. My blood turns cold, and I just lay there. He finally gets up and leaves, and I finally am relieved, but I cannot sleep the whole night and just lay there in my bed. Finally, the next morning, I get up and I go out into the living room. My dad is asleep on his lazy boy recliner, and his nose is bleeding. I wake him up and I tell him I'm spooked, and I ask him about the blood. He has no idea where it came from. I ask him about the night before, and he has no idea what I'm talking about, and he doesn't remember waking me up from being on top of his car. My heart drops when he states that it was still Friday, when I know for a fact that it was definitely Saturday. He argues with me until I show him my phone with the day and time. At this point, we are both freaked out. I've never ventured out into the woods since then, and nothing strange has happened, except sometimes I will hear the front door open and shut a few times during the night. In 1969, I was 9 years old and I lived about a half mile down the road from an old church and cemetery. There were 2 other old homes there, but no one lived in them. There were strange things that happened quite often around where I lived back then. I remember one of the strange things that happened very well. My dad worked evenings from 3 p.m. till 11 p.m., just 3 miles down the road from our house. My mom and sister and I had just gone to bed when we started to hear a bumping sound on the back of the house. My sister and I ran from the bedroom we shared, in the back of the house, to the front of the house where my mother and father's bedroom was. My sister and I were scared, so my mother let us sleep with her until our father came home around 11 p.m. that night. Their bedroom had 2 windows, side by side, on the front of the house, above the porch. You could see through the curtains at night due to the streetlight out front. We were lying there after not hearing any more noises when all of a sudden we had heard something on the front porch. Mom saw it first and sat up in bed. That made my sister and I notice her staring out the window. When we turned our gaze from our mom to the front window, we saw what looked like a very large dog on our front porch. It was walking to the front door upright on its back legs. When the creature reached the front door, it shook it violently. It was as tall as the door, and we could see it scratching at the screen door with its front paws. It remained there for what seemed like 15 minutes, but in reality, it was more like 1 or 2. My mother didn't say a word. She just shushed us until it turned and walked about 10 feet to the steps on its back legs. Just before it reached the steps, it went back down on all 4 legs. My mother told us to go back to sleep, and we eventually did. I do not remember her telling my dad, but I do remember this well. It was 6 to 6.5 feet tall, while standing upright on its hind legs. You could see its facial features, its ears, its snout, its head. Those features made it resemble a German shepherd. I'm not entirely sure what I saw that night, but this I am sure of, is that I do not want to see that creature face to face. I am a 24-year-old male and I live in the middle of nowhere. I was getting home late one day after dropping my sister off at the airport in Lamar, Colorado. I live just under 7 miles north of the Oklahoma border on 250 acres of land. I have a trap line running around my property for coyotes. The first 2 traps I checked were empty, so I headed south. That's when I saw this thing. At first I thought it was a coyote, a big coyote. It was almost 5 feet tall on all fours. It was caught in my trap and was running around making a dust cloud, and then it stopped and looked at me. Now I'm used to a Duke number 3 holding leg trap, so I could catch a variety of things in it. Anyways, I slammed on the brakes and my truck stalled because it was a manual. I was fumbling for the keys to start it. It's an old farm truck with a carburetor on it, and it had quite an afterfire. Once the creature heard that, it lunged at me and roared. I saw that it had its hand, not a paw but hand, caught in my trap, right hand to be exact. It had probably been looking for a dead rabbit I had in the bait hole next to the trap. It then stood up and ripped the 2 earth anchors I had, 24 inches in the ground, right out. It took me a long time to put those things in there with a 10-pound hammer, but it pulled them straight out within 15 seconds. After it did that, it just stood there, looking at me. It felt like an eternity, and I knew that my .357 would not do anything to stop this thing if it came at me. I prayed to God that it wouldn't come for me in my truck. I was looking at it in shock and awe, and I noticed that it had orange eyes. They weren't glowing. Instead, they had quite a tint, kind of like cat's eyes in the dark. They may have been reflecting my headlights, but I wasn't sure. It then took a step towards me and curled its upper lip, showing me its teeth. The teeth were huge. The 2 longest ones appeared to be 4 to 5 inches long. It then growled at me, and in the blink of an eye, the creature was gone. I was scared crapless. I jammed the truck into gear and spun the tires out, trying to get out of there. Like I said earlier, it felt like an eternity, but it had lasted no more than 30 seconds. I returned later with my Native American friend. He is a part Arapaho. I grew up with him and I trust him. He told me some stories that were passed down through his grandparents' tribe, and mentioned something about a loup-garou, or a French werewolf. He also told me about how fur trappers in the late 1700s were chased off the land in the Rockies from this thing. Having seen this creature, I do not blame the trappers for leaving. A mate I grew up with, this Aboriginal bloke, we were camping and I went out for a pee in the dark night. We were way inland, behind some rock hills. Tall dead cane grass was everywhere and we couldn't see very far. After I relieved myself, I heard my mate calling me, but it was away from the camp. It was strange as I had just left him in the camp. I waited. He called again, no mistaking his voice. I called back and started walking out towards him. This went on for a little while, sometimes changing directions, calling me deeper and deeper into the woods. Suddenly, someone grabs me and I leap out of my skin and spin around. I have already realized I have walked deep into the cane grass and I am disoriented. My poor sphincter had taken a bite out of my shorts. It was a very somber face, my mate's face, deadly serious. I'm thrown into confusion. I'm a little bit angry. "What are you doing? You were out in front of me. How did you get behind me?" He says. It isn't me. We stand still. It's completely silent. I'm starting to get mad, but I can see his fear in his face. I wait. Sure enough, his voice calls again. Now I'm freaked out. I'm all wide-eyed and staring at him. He whispers, "Bad spirit. We'll go back to the camp straight away." If I knew where the effing camp was, I would have ran straight up his back to get there. At the camp, he tells me of how, for eons, that this had happened to his people. They get called away with familiar voices. Sometimes they make it back and tell them what happened, and sometimes they're young and they perish. I know what I experienced, so there's no denying it, but I always console myself with the explanation that it was some type of mimicking bird. If he hadn't heard me out there and come track me down, well, who knows what would have happened. I was 15 at the time, and roughly the same age of my cousins and brother at the time. We were all within 1 year of each other. We go into the woods to be manly and do whatever guys do. We have normal supplies, axe, hatchet, knives, matches, you name it. It's getting late in the woods and we were extra manly since we were 15, but we decided to head back because the bugs are kinda too much. On our way back, there's a pretty androgynous looking person on our trail, just standing there with torn clothes. "Hey, are you lost? We can lead you out if you want." This person starts doing this dry heaving motion like they were dry heaving but lifting their elbows too. Very unnatural looking. I say to the person, "What are you doing?" Whatever it was stops heaving. It opens its mouth and lets out this scream. It's unlike anything I have ever heard before. Normally, I would have ran away, but there was about 15 of us and we all had small weapons. We just stand our ground and lift our weapons up in defense mode. The thing cricks its head unnaturally towards us, like they do in almost every possessed movie, and smiles at us. We all scream to get away from us, and sure enough, whatever it was did. Once the creature was out of our sight, we instantly stopped hearing any of the noises that came from it. It was as if it was still hiding behind a tree, waiting for anyone to come around looking for it. At this point, however, we were pretty spooked and we decided to get out of there. It was about 3 weeks until I finally went back into the woods. My wife asks me to go camping. I hate the idea, but she's pretty excited. Sure, why not? We drive to a secluded bit of land by her grandparents' house. We spend hours setting up the tent in the campsite. We get ready and go hiking. As we are hiking, however, it rains a little bit and we get a bit wet. We double back and get back just in time before it gets dark. We make a fire and the wife is getting a little bit tired, kinda low energy. We eat dinner and talk for a while, then we decide it's time to go to bed. We inflate our air mattress and get our double sleeping bag out. We get in together and she's shivering. I ask her, is she okay? And she says that she's fine. She keeps shivering and I don't feel good about this. "You said you were fine. I don't want to ruin our trip or anything, but I think we should go back." I feel her face, and it's pretty hot. "Well, it won't be any fun if you don't feel well tomorrow. I think it'd be better if we just leave. You might have a fever." She agrees and we head back to our home. As we decide to get our things packed up, I put her in the car to wait as I finish putting the tent and other odds and ends back into the car. I turn the car on and place her inside. I turn the heat on high so she can get warm. I go back into the tent and start to deflate the air mattress when I hear the horn beeping from outside. I run out over to the car and my wife says that there was someone around in our campsite. She said that they were crawling. She said that as soon as she saw them and was sure it was a person, she made sure to beep the horn to notify me. I can tell she's pretty upset about this. I didn't believe her at the time, considering the state that she was in. I tell her to relax and rest up as I finish up packing. I gather everything outside the tent and step back in to roll up the mattress. I hear her yell my name. It sounded like it came from the woods. Why is she outside of the car? I then hear her yell, "Help me, my leg is bleeding." I rush out and I glance over to the car, but she's still inside, asleep. A wave of fear washes over me and I hear something yell again from the woods. This time it doesn't sound anything like my wife.
"Help me."
I begin to freak out and instead of packing up the tent properly, I just roll it up as best I can and shove it into the car. I left a few unimportant items behind considering I was in a rush and I didn't want to meet whatever it was out in the woods. I start driving and we finally make it home. When my wife finally wakes up, I ask her, "What did you see out in the woods?" She gets really serious and looks very stern in her face. She said that it was very white and thought it was a naked person crawling behind some trees. She then saw them stand up against the tree and began to beep the horn to get my attention. Then, whatever it was, got down on all fours again and took off crawling into the woods. In a way, I'm kind of glad that my wife got sick, so that we would not be outside any longer with that thing. Here are just a few of some of my favorite stories coming from the Skinwalker Ranch. Keep in mind that this is not a comprehensive list. There are probably stories that I like much more that I have not heard of coming from this location. With that being said, let's get to the stories. Skinwalker Ranch has been dubbed the world's hotspot from paranormal activity to UFO and skinwalker sightings. There have also been multiple sightings of humanoid creatures, as well as aliens in this area. The Skinwalker Ranch is located in the Uinta Basin. The Native American tribe, the Utes, believe that the Navajo tribe placed a curse on this area to curse the Ute tribe during their inhabitation of this area. To this day, both tribes refuse to walk onto this land. The beginning of the Skinwalker Ranch is just as mysterious as the events that plagued it. The land was believed to be owned by, but not used by, a family that refused to stay there. This was until the early 90s that the Sherman family came to purchase the property at an incredible price. The Shermans were up-and-coming cattle farmers, and this location would be perfect for them to live and herd cattle. Upon the first viewing of the property's home, the home was disorganized and showed signs of a concerning lifestyle. All of the home's entrances, including the windows, had heavy deadbolts on them, preventing anyone or anything to enter the home. Not only were these entrances laden with these locks, but also the interior room doors on both sides. This is often thought as to lock something or someone in a room if anything did get inside the house. The area behind the front door had these hooks with large chains hooked up to it. Many people think that the previous owners owned large dogs to protect the home from dangerous intruders. The Shermans were startled by this, but not enough to dissuade them from purchasing the property. Upon the first day of moving in, the Shermans were unpacking their vehicles when the father noticed a large animal gingerly making its way towards them. At first, the family had no idea what they were looking at due to the large size of the animal, and also the large distance at which the animal was away. Upon the creature coming closer, they were able to see that the creature was a large wolf. The account said that the wolf's head was able to come to Terry Sherman's shoulder. Terry was above 6 feet tall, so this was quite startling. What was even more startling than the creature's size was the creature's actions. Instead of appearing wild and untamed, the creature came up to Mr. Sherman, allowing him to pet him. After petting the large wolf a few times, Terry allowed his family to come over and pet what appeared to be their new friend. During this time, not so far away, was an enclosed cattle area where cattle had just been transported. The cattle were aware of what was going on with the family and the wolf, and the cattle seemed to react how they do when most predators are nearby. All except for one lone calf that was sticking its head out of the pen to get a better view of the wolf. Once the wolf saw the young calf make its fatal mistake, the huge beast quickly closed the gap and bit down on the calf's neck that was exposed from the metal bars of the pen. Terry watched in horror as the beast began thrashing around with the calf's neck in its jaws. Terry grabbed an axe handle and began beating the beast in the hind legs and ribs, hopefully to release its clinch on the calf. This had no effect on the beast, and told his son, who was watching all of this unfold, to grab the .357 Magnum in the truck and to give it to him. The son did as told, and Terry fired 3 shots point blank. The beast didn't even respond until Terry shot one at its heart. The large wolf then let go, but only wandered a few feet away, seemingly unharmed. Terry went inside and grabbed his hunting rifle and aimed it again at the beast. When he fired, chunks of the beast would fly off clearly, marking a hit, but the beast would only walk a few meters away into the woods, seemingly unharmed. Terry and his son would follow the beast into the woods, but after some time of tracking the large wolf prints, the prints would disappear as if the animal vanished into thin air. The next strange event would be cattle mutilations. This was originally thought to be the result of a larger animal, especially the wolf from the first day, but was later discarded due to the strange nature of the mutilation of the animals on the ranch. The cattle found around the ranch would have strange cuts and removed only some organs. These cuts seemed to be precision cut with a laser of some kind, due to the cuts of also being cauterized. This became an issue for the Shermans. Each mutilated livestock would result in thousands of dollars in lost goods. Around the same time as these mutilations were sightings of UFOs in the distance. The first account that stood out was when Terry was walking around the property with his son and nephew. They then saw what appeared to be headlights within the boundaries of the Sherman property. Terry thought that maybe these were the men responsible for the cattle mutilations, so he went to confront them. While walking to confront whoever was behind the set of headlights, something strange happened. The lights seemed to drive away, but then ascend into the sky. The lights then flew into the night sky, leaving the Shermans absolutely baffled. Even more disturbing than the cattle's being mutilated would be one of the events where the Sherman's family pet dog would chase after a light in the nearby forest. Terry was not able to keep up with his dog, but also chased the light in the forest, hopefully being able to find some answers. While following his dog, Terry was able to hear his dog in the distance and was using his dog's bark to help him locate his pet. However, about midway through the dense forest, he heard his dog begin to whine and then heard a strange machine-like noise, and then silence. Terry searched the forest but was not able to find his dog. What he was able to find was what appeared to be a puddle of goop and burnt hair in the circle on the ground. Many people believe that this is the result of an alien vaporizing his dog. Another occurrence that plagued the Sherman family was the paranormal activity within the home on the ranch. Gwen Sherman, Terry's wife, would report things moving around the home in a fashion very similar to paranormal activity, much like a poltergeist. One common instance would be when Gwen would shower. Gwen would have a shower routine that she never strayed from, which required her to place a hairbrush and a towel next to the shower to make the morning routine all the more easier. However, since moving to the ranch, Gwen had noticed that her brush and towel would be moving or missing altogether. This would only be the beginning of what would be a terrifying next couple of years for the Shermans. Gwen would also experience other odd occurrences, such as her putting away her groceries, only to return to the kitchen to find the groceries back in the plastic bags. Both Gwen and Terry would also see a menacing shadow figure around the ranch, which would eventually find its way inside the Sherman home. The shadow figure would be reported to be peering into windows and shaking the home, terrorizing the family. Things would become much more worse with the Shadow Man. There's an account with Terry and Gwen both waking up in sleep paralysis to see the Shadow Man standing at the foot of their bed. Some people think that the Shadow Man was a ghost that once lived on the property, while many others believe that it's an interdimensional being, kind of like an alien, that was trying to warn the family of what's to come. Around this time, in 1995, Robert Bigelow heard about this ranch and formed a group called NIDS, or National Institute of Discovery Science. This group would study many fringe sciences, from UFOlogy to wormholes and other paranormal activity. But don't let this dissuade you into thinking that this was a group of weekend warriors or ghost hunters with video cameras. This group was comprised of many PhD scientists in chemistry and other notable sciences. All the people involved were highly credited personnel in the science community. Robert offered to purchase the property from Terry for $200,000, which Terry agreed to as long as he could be ranch manager and still house his cattle on the land. Robert agreed, since he was only wanting the land to be able to conduct tests with his new formed group. The first couple of months were uneventful for the new ownership. This led to many people believing that Terry fabricated or stretched the truth to be able to sell his land for more than it was actually worth. However, things did begin to pick up when the team began seeing the lights in the sky. The NIDS team did everything they could to disprove the lights in the sky, from testing the magnetic frequencies in the area, to even testing to see if there was a fault line nearby. The team also tested plants and ground samples to see if there were any hallucinating properties in that area that would cause people to see strange things. The test yielded nothing out of the ordinary. The team would also go out at night with night vision goggles to see if they could see anything that was happening with the cattle that were still being mutilated. The results were disturbing. With the aid of NIDS and night vision, Terry and the team were able to spot large creatures that resembled dog people that would walk on their hind legs. They also came across a few instances where they would seem to see a creature using an invisibility cloak of some kind. You're probably thinking, how do you see something that's invisible? Well, they were able to see this because they would see cattle being pushed as if something large was walking through the herd of cattle. They also witnessed, on one instance, water being displaced as if something was walking through a stream, but were to be invisible. This led to probably one of the most disturbing instances on the ranch. One evening, 2 members of the Knits group were out scoping out the valley at 3:30 a.m. One member had a pair of binoculars, while the other was taking photos with an infrared camera. In the valley below, the team member saw with the binoculars what appeared to be a light that was emanating a strange color. The light grew, and the man with the binoculars said that he was able to see something what appeared to be a portal of some kind, due to being able to see onto the other side, which looked like a grotesque landscape. In this portal appeared to be a creature crawling on its hands and knees, but at a fast pace. This creature was naked with no fur. It looked similar to a person, but the limbs were long and bent at weird angles. The creature was able to make its way close enough to the team that they were able to hear the sound of rocks moving underneath its feet before disappearing. "3 months ago, I was camping with a friend in a very remote part of Northern California. I'm a massive wilderness junkie. I have been camping all of my life, and I spend so much of my free time hiking and rock climbing, etc. A buddy of mine, who also enjoys the outdoors, wanted to head up to the Sierras for a weekend and asked me to go with him. It was our second night, and we were sitting by the campfire. We weren't staying at a campsite. We had hiked for about 10 miles from our cars to a clearing with a beautiful view. We had stayed once before. Around 10 p.m., my buddy got tired and went to bed in his tent. I wanted to stay up for a little bit longer. About 45 minutes after he went to bed, I saw this object coming from the valley below. It was a basic flying saucer shape, with multiple circular lights rotating around the edges that changed colors over and over. I was completely shocked. I watched it for maybe 15 seconds, then decided I had to wake him up so he could see and not think I was crazy. I stood, and when I looked back towards it, the thing was gone. I called out his name, and that's when everything got really weird. I didn't hear my own voice when I called out. Everything was completely silent. I could move my eyes around, but nothing else on my body. I remember seeing the fire had completely frozen, and everything looked like a picture, like time had stopped or something. Then there was a flash of light, and I blacked out. I woke up later just as the sun was starting to rise. I was outside laying in the dirt, shivering next to the fire that had been long out. I felt like I had been drugged, totally in this haze. I sluggishly yelled out to my friend a couple of times, and he came out of the tent. He was really confused, to say the least. I tried to explain to him what happened, but my memory was really foggy, and I couldn't articulate the words properly. We left within 30 minutes. I was totally silent on our car ride back, falling in and out of sleep for several hours. He dropped me off at my house, and I passed out for basically the entire day. A few weeks later, I was messing around with an amp, and it released this static ooh sound when I unplugged my guitar. For some reason, this sound somehow triggered my memory, and I remembered everything. When I came back into consciousness, I was suspended laterally in a circular mechanism in a position very similar to Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. These clear glass-like shackles, type restraints, were holding me in place. I was completely nude, and standing above me were 3 typical aliens. They were about 4 feet tall, and wearing white spandex-like suits. 2 were just standing there, observing the other, who was extracting blood from a vein under my armpit with this weird-looking syringe. Although they didn't show any real reaction, I could still tell that they were surprised that I was awake. I couldn't move at all, except for my eyes and lips. I was absolutely terrified. In a sort of fight or flight mode, my heart pounded from an influx of adrenaline. I can't even begin to tell you how scared I was, but I also felt this total rage. I wanted to kill them. I wanted to rip out this device and completely destroy them. My brain went totally primal. Just animal instinct, and I could tell that they could sense my anger because they all stepped back simultaneously. 2 of them disappeared from my view and presumably left the room. The other one was just staring at me, void of any emotion. I wanted so badly to just shut my eyes, but I forced myself to stare right back at it, trying my hardest not to blink. Then the other 2 came back, and they weren't alone. I honestly couldn't believe my eyes. Standing behind them were 2 very tall, very human-looking beings, a male and female. They looked like Norse gods, with bright golden hair and massive eyes. The male eyes were dark and blue, the females were violet. I suppose they are what the UFO community refers to as Nordics. This was quite bizarre to me. My family descended from Sweden, and I am very Nordic looking. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the works. I know this is cliché, but I heard a feminine voice in my mind. For some reason, I could understand what she was telling me, although it wasn't like she was saying anything in English. She told me something like, "Be calm, you're not in danger." I relaxed and asked her what they wanted with me. She said that they were just checking up on me. I asked her what she meant by that. She said that she had saved me from when I first came into being. I immediately knew what she was talking about. I was born 2 months premature. My mother was horribly sick during labor. We both had fevers of 104. The strange thing is that the doctors had absolutely no idea what was wrong with us. I was given 2 spinal taps, my mother 3. I spent 4 nights in that bubble housing ICU thing. There was a decent chance I was going to die. Then one day, I started getting better and made a full recovery. The doctors were very worried that the whole ordeal might have permanently damaged my body and possibly my brain, but I was totally fine. I asked her, "Why did you save me?" This time I heard a deep male voice stating that this conversation was for a later time. I asked him if they are human. He said, "No." I was confused considering that they looked quite human. I asked him if man had come from them. He said yes, that they had come here 200,000 years ago and created mankind by combining their DNA with that of our primate ancestors. I wanted to know why they looked especially similar to me more than other humans. He stated that many males of their kind found female humans attractive and mated with them. This directly passed on some of their physical features to Nordic people. I wanted to know more, but they declined and said that it was time for me to go back. I blacked out instantly and woke up by the extinguished campfire, clothed and shivering.
My parents used to be big outdoor buffs. My father is an ex-champion hobby boat racer, and my mother was an Alabama-raised country girl. They went on a trip with their friends when I was about 10 years old, and since then, they've refused to go camping anymore. Ever. My dad told me this story sometime after I had turned 18. My parents moved around a lot and only had one set of friends that they really kept in touch with, Danny and Lisa. Danny and Lisa weren't actually outdoor nuts, but they liked to hang out with my parents and did whatever they wanted to do. They all planned a 5-day trip to a lake south of where they lived with a creek that was on Danny's father's property, so they could keep camping and fish on the property all they wanted. My dad tells me that the first 2 days were normal, just camping, drinking, sharing stories while fishing and boating. The second night, though, was when things started to get weird. The second night, they kept hearing yelps coming from the woods. It sounded like 2 dogs were in a fight, but they were just both hurt and yelping the whole time.
They figured they were just coyotes and slept. The next day, they continued on their adventures. That night, they kept hearing those noises again, except this time, they were extremely close. So my dad and Danny went out to see if they could scare them off, while my mom and Lisa stayed behind, being scared out of their minds, hiding in the tent. Anyway, my dad and Danny went looking in the woods for these coyotes that were fighting. My dad had a shotgun and Danny had a machete. My dad was just hoping to scare the coyotes, or whatever they were, with a loud gunshot. He wasn't actually trying to go kill them. They got to a clearing and could hear the noise, extremely loud, but it seemed to be coming from multiple directions. Now my dad was a bit of a kook. He swears that he saw Bigfoot at 14, but this is different. He just told Danny to get back. No questions, no explanations. Just, Danny, we need to get back. So they did, but the sounds didn't fade away this time. Danny nervously asked my dad what was going on, but my dad wouldn't tell him. He just kept shushing him. Danny is a bit of a goofball, hence why I always liked Danny, and called him my Uncle Danny, so he thought that my dad was getting back at him for a prank. Danny kept nudging my dad, trying to get him to say, "Gotcha," but my dad never untensed. Finally, they got close to the creek, a ways up from the camp, and my dad told Danny to run. Fast. Sprint. Then my dad took off. No remorse. Danny apparently followed, but tripped and called out to my dad. My dad, unfortunately, refused to go back for him, even though Danny started crying and calling out for help. Danny was yelling that his leg was broken, it hurt, etc., but my dad kept running. Then, my dad, my mother, and Lisa all hear a really loud cougar roar coming from the woods. My dad says it sounded like two lionesses roaring, but times 70. My dad says that it was so loud that it made his ears ring. After that roar, the cries from Danny had stopped. My dad got back to camp, and the ladies asked them what was going on, but my dad just said that there was something out there. My mother, being practical, says, "Well, yeah, no duh, but what was it?" My dad wouldn't answer. Lisa is freaking out and asking where Danny is, but my dad just keeps saying that he'll be here in a second. A few hours pass, and the ladies are extremely worried about Danny, while my dad would only cringe when they would say something. Finally, from the opposite side my dad had arrived from, Danny came walking out, just fine, wordlessly. My dad cocked his shotgun, but waved it as a survival readiness, something my mother says she'll never forget. This is when my mother knew that something was wrong. Danny then walks up to camp and nudges his way next to my mother, but after the weird looks that he's getting and the death glare from my father, he then moves closer to Lisa, who's been nagging at him for the next 10 minutes. But Danny would only grunt yes or no, or would just stare into the fire. My dad finally asked Danny what had happened to his leg, and Danny looked up confused. My dad told him, "I thought you said it was broken." Danny then looked up at him and replied, "Broken." Then, as if on cue, he starts screaming, "Oh, my leg! I think it's broken!" The ladies in the group obviously want to try to treat Danny's leg, but Danny doesn't seem to want any help. The ladies in the group rationalize and say that Danny must have been in shock, and that explains why he was acting so weird, but my dad isn't buying it. While the ladies are still trying to negotiate with Danny, my dad then suggests that, "Hey, let's just go to bed and we'll worry about it tomorrow." My mom gives him a look and my dad gives her another look, and they both agree to go to the tent. During the night, my parents said that they heard Lisa nagging to Danny, and he would never reply to any of her responses. Being enraged, she then finally says that she's going to go out in the woods and pee. Danny asks if he could come with her since there were animals out in the woods. She says okay, and they left. My dad woke up about 10ish in the morning and started making breakfast. Danny and Lisa were gone. My mom asked where they were, and my dad would not reply. After a little while, they both came back, rather unceremoniously, and without a word. They weren't holding hands, and they were not in each other's arms as usual, just kind of awkwardly standing next to each other. They refused food, and Danny would randomly yell out, "My leg," and Lisa would randomly complain about feeling ill. My mom then suggested that they go home and call off the trip on account of Danny's leg. Danny had not been limping at all. Danny and Lisa just nodded. My father just kind of watched. They all agreed, so Danny and Lisa got in my parents' car, not theirs, and just waited. They didn't pack up anything, any coolers, tents, bags, anything. My mom came over and asked if they were going to grab their things, and they just shook their heads. My dad asked, "Why don't you take your car?" And they both said, "Broken." Just like Danny had the night before. My dad sighed and packed up the car and they drove off. Danny and Lisa stayed quiet the whole way, and except for their random mumblings to each other, completely indecipherable. My parents then took them home, and they came and got me afterwards from the babysitter. I could tell that something was wrong, besides coming back a couple days early. They said that Danny got hurt, so they had to come home. I remember asking if I could go see Danny and Lisa, but my dad replied, no, a little too quickly, and so I thought that he was mad at them. I remember this as a child because they were kind of my friends too, and I figured my dad was just being mean. A few weeks later, I asked about Uncle Danny, and my dad said that we're not going to see them anymore. I was mad, and so I demanded to know why. He told me something about his dad being sick, and so I was really sad. Then I forgot about it and life went on. Fast forward 5 years. I am at the supermarket where I used to live and remembered that Danny and Lisa lived not too far away from here. Now that I was able to drive, I decided to drive around and see if I could find Danny and Lisa's old home. I am driving rather slowly and kinda creepily to see if I can find Danny and Lisa's old home. Sure enough, I spot Danny walking down the street. I'm really excited and I flag him down and pull over. He seems kinda stiff, kind of robotic. When I got out and hugged him, he seemed way too tight and felt like he was trying to smother me. I had asked him how he'd been and he said alright. I asked him how Lisa was and where they were, and asked if I could see her. He agreed. I asked about all the mutual friends that we had, and he seemed kind of confused, like he didn't remember about 90% of them, which seemed odd, mainly because Danny was my awesome involved uncle. Being a bit paranoid, I decided to ask him a couple of trick questions. He failed miserably. Now, I'm a bit nervous. We get to his door and he opens it, and the smell hits me like a garbage truck. It smells like a meat locker that had went out of business and they left all the meat inside. The smell literally assaulted my nostrils. The place was a wreck, just crap everywhere. Everything is coated in dust and crap and nothing looks clean. Laundry is everywhere. No lights are on and it's just a mess. Now I'm really freaking out. I ask him, "Danny, what's going on here?" He just lets out this weird guttural grunt. I asked about Lisa, and I hear a yell coming from the kitchen. The kitchen was just the next room over, and I could hear and smell something cooking. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to see Lisa making some normal food and planning to ask Lisa and Danny what had happened, and why they were acting so weird. But when I walked into the kitchen, I saw something really disturbing. It was unforgettable. Lisa was standing in the kitchen, but she's completely naked, covered in blood and this mangled mess, surrounded by thousands of bones. I was just smart enough to notice a pile of dog collars in the corner. Obviously, being disturbed with what I saw, I let out a yell and Danny lunged at me. I clumsily ran out of the room and out of the house, Danny chasing me the entire way. I made it back to my home and told my parents what had happened. My dad looked like he wanted to punch me in the face. We called the police and the police investigated. They came back and said that no one was in the home, but everything matched about the story I told them. The place was a complete wreck. The police said some BS story that me and my father didn't believe. They told us that maybe some hobos had lived there and they ate the cats and dogs in the neighborhood. Obviously we didn't believe them, and my father asked them why the house had not been foreclosed. They stammered, considering that they knew that we were onto them. And we later found out that Danny's parents actually were paying for the home. But my encounter and my father's story makes everything all the more weird. After my final and last encounter with Danny and Lisa, I finally agree with my parents that I will never go camping again.